Chapter 5:22. This was a very realistic problem. The so-called killing people and preventing them from divulging a secret was so. Yi Shiwen would certainly die if they didn't die. He might escape if one great sage expert were to chase him. However, what about a group of great sage experts? How would he escape then? Also, these people wanted to kill him as well. Therefore, letting them live could prove to be even more troublesome for him. Yi Shiwen deliberated for a while. He then decided to put away the Thousand Stars tyrant palm. He had obtained this palm technique from the blood-red clothed young master. However, he had never used it. In fact, he hadn't even practiced it. Right now, he wanted to annihilate these people in the shortest span of time. Otherwise, some formidable ancient demon beasts might arrive here, and that would be too bad. One mustn't forget that each of these beasts possessed extraordinary spiritual intelligence. This spiritual intelligence wasn't inferior to the intelligence of an ordinary human. Moreover, many of them had been alive since thousands of years and were simply old foxes. So, why wouldn't they have any interest in the treasures that were present here? Yi Shiwen attacked without any hesitation after he thought of this. His entire body transformed into a universe. This was a universe that had existed since eternity, a universe that was spread everywhere. An eternal universe. The so-called eternal universe was the collection of space and time, and only God could control space and time. Yi Zaiwen's universe was continuously growing. In fact, there would come a day when he would have so much power that he would be able to control the entirety of time and space. And nobody would be able to do him any harm when that would happen. He hadn't become that terrifying at present. However, faint signs of it were present. His universe would transform into a realm one day. However, this was a matter for the future. Yi Zaiwen's fist suddenly pressed down like a huge star. It carried terrifying momentum. In fact, it seemed like a boundless galaxy as it swept down on Shangfeiwa to crush him. Yi Shiwen had attacked with all of his strength. This was the first time that he had attacked with his entire strength ever since he had made the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. So, this attack was entirely different from the ones that he had performed when he was in the initial stage of Sage Realm. After all, he had made a substantial progress. Yi Zaiwen's ferocious aura arrived over Shengfeiyu's head and overwhelmed him completely. It looked incredible. Shengfeiyu had started his journey many years ago, and he had become a famous Heaven's Pride expert in a very short span of time after he had entered the meteor sect. However, the meteor world and the true martial world were different. The true martial world had changed into a place where independent warlords used to compete for the power that had been vacated with the decline of the true martial university. However, the meteor sect was still in its flourishing period. The meteor sect alone was the largest force. Therefore, there weren't many competitions taking place in the meteor sect. The Heaven's Pride experts were particularly considered to be isolated, and they weren't allowed to compete with each other, at least not until they had reached the Sage Realm. Therefore, Shangfeiyu had never fought with the Heaven's Pride experts of his generation, let alone with a person like Yi Shiwen, who had taken the lives of many Heaven's Pride experts. He may have been engaged in the occasional fights, but he had never been beaten down before. Moreover, Yi Shiwen was much younger than him. Yi Shiwen used his entire strength and didn't hold back one bit. The Big Bang Stardust Fist rushed through several hundred miles. It smashed the void into pieces wherever it went, and the chaos was unleashed from the other side. Then, this startling attack suddenly materialized in front of Shangfeiyu. Bang! Shengfeiyu's Thousand Stars tyrant palm got crushed in an instant. The starlight that had spread across the entire sky also vanished. Instead, Yi Zaiwen's fist exploded like the Big Bang. Crack, crack! The horrifying sound of breaking of bones could be heard. Shengfeiyu's hands had gotten crushed. After that, his body entered the spatial fault. The space broke down and he sank into it. His entire body had been drenched in blood. He was in a tragic state. The scene looked too horrible. Senior Brother Sheng has sustained injuries. Those people of the imperial clan of the Great Wei State were left dumbstruck as they saw this scene. Sheng Feiyue was a godlike figure to them. However, he had been seriously injured by this Dragon Master. He was considered among the top-notch heavens pride experts of the meteor sect. However, he was left powerless and unable to fight back. It seemed as if they had been brought back to their senses by the sound of a loud and ear-piercing thunderclap. However, the power of Yi Zaiwen's fist didn't decrease. It swept down and struck Sheng Feiyue's main body. His bones began to issue gurgle sound under the ferocious pressure, and blood gushed out from his entire body. Sheng Feiyue was struggling with all his strength. His body had begun to transform into flames under the starlight. He looked like a burning fireball, like a star that had illuminated the eternal universe. These burning flames began to burn Yi Zaiwen's fist. This produced a noise. It wasn't clear how hot those flames were. However, they looked exceptionally ferocious. Yi Shiwen laughed loudly. "You think this will work?" An ordinary person would have gotten burnt to death by these terrifying flames. This was also one of the hidden cards of Sheng Feiyue's. However, Yi Shiwen had practiced the tyrant body technique till the 7th layer. In fact, he could even contend against a sage tool with his bare hands. So, one could imagine how ferocious his body had become. Therefore, it was impossible for him to be defeated by such a counterattack. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist had transformed into a huge star, and it refused to bow under the impact of this counterattack. Instead, his fist pounded even more quickly. Those princes and other experts felt as if two stars had suddenly collided in a boundless universe. The world had collapsed, and everyone had been left to tremble with fear. "Ah!" Sheng Feiyue screamed. He appeared to be in an exceptionally dire situation. Yi Zaiwen's ferocious fist had already crushed his entire body. His flesh had also begun to tear apart, and his thick bones had become exposed. His blood had started to splash out as well. It was evident that he had sustained very serious injuries. He realized that he had messed with the wrong person. "I won't go down!" Sheng Feiyue roared, and his voice stirred the horizon. However, Yi Shiwen didn't show any mercy as his mountain-like fist slammed down on Sheng Feiyue. Rumble! Sheng Feiyue's bones got shattered, and more of his blood splashed out. It looked terrible. His internal organs had been destroyed, and his soul was also annihilated. Yi Shiwen searched for Sheng Feiyue's storage ring. Sheng Feiyue was extremely rich when compared to a troubled person like Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen alternated between being rich and poor. He swept in his divine sense and found an abundance of wealth inside Sheng Feiyue's stock. The amount of primary spirit dawn was alone more than 30 million, and the total wealth surpassed 100 million after the value of the various other treasures were added to it. It could be said that Sheng Feiyue had been far wealthier than ordinary sage experts. Of course, even this wealth of 100 million might not be enough for a spendthrift like Yi Shiwen. You dared to kill him." The third prince was shocked. His heart sank as he realized that Sheng Feiyue had been killed. "It seems like I did." Yi Shiwen replied in a carefree manner. He was standing in the sky, and he was looking down at everyone like they were already dead. That's right. He was looking at a group of dead people. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen was looking into their eyes. A chill ran down the second prince's spine. He had suddenly realized that Yi Shiwen could kill all of them. "You want to kill us," the second prince spoke up. His complexion had changed very significantly since he couldn't stop himself from getting scared this time. He knew that Yi Shiwen would kill all of them in order to preserve the secret of this place. Otherwise, the secret of this place would certainly leak out. "Run! Quickly!" The third prince shouted. He transformed into a streamer of light and promptly flew in one direction. Everyone else also flew away in different directions in quick succession. He believed that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to kill all of them if they escaped in different directions. And he was obviously hoping that he would be able to escape while Yi Shiwen was killing the other people. Humph! Yi Shiwen snorted. The spirit energies began to condense frantically in the air. Then a super huge wave condensed and swept out. It then condensed into a great seal that filled the sky. And the inverting ocean seal suddenly swept down. Bang! A huge explosion occurred. A vast space got smashed to pieces. The chaos leaked out from the cracks in the space and overflowed the entire sky. Bang! Those people wanted to escape. However, it was impossible for them to match Yi Zaiwen's speed. Yi Shiwen had destroyed them in a split second. Overturning the heavens seal was a wonderful ancient technique. One could even overturn the blue dome of heaven if one practiced this technique to the peak. Yi Shiwen practiced this technique all the time. However, he had grasped it only recently. In fact, he hadn't even practiced the inverting ocean seal to the peak. So, it wasn't clear when he would grasp the overturning the heaven seal, let alone practice it to the pinnacle. Yi Shiwen wiped clean the traces after he had annihilated these people. He then conveniently collected the dead body of the massive star colossus. This star colossus was enormous, so it was very difficult for Yi Shiwen to collect it and put it inside even though it was dead. Fortunately, he had the heavenly source mirror. So he placed the star colossus inside the heavenly source mirror. An ordinary spatial ring or some other space-type divine tool would have broken down if it had been used in place of the heavenly source mirror. Yi Shiwen had only consumed a little bit of this star colossus star core in order to make the breakthrough to the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. After that, Yi Shiwen started to play with Shen Feiyu's divine tool palace. He could only sigh at this huge world since it was full of extraordinary wonders. Someone had actually made a sage tool out of a palace. Moreover, it could attack as well as defend. Such a divine tool was extremely rare. In fact, it was rarer than those inner divine armors and those other defensive divine tools. However, this wasn't enough to tempt Yi Shiwen. After all, Yimo was undoubtedly more important to him than these rare divine tools. Yi Shiwen would gamble everything if it meant waking up Yimo from his slumber. Not to mention that Yimo had become like this for his sake. In fact, Yi Shiwen would have long become a cold corpse if Yimo hadn't saved him. Yi Shiwen had realized that this star colossus was a treasure house of herbs. Its corpse was like an incomparably huge stockpile of resources. He had only absorbed a little bit of the star core, and even that had been enough for him to make the breakthrough into the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. Therefore, Yimo would surely get well soon if he swallowed this entire colossus. Yi Shiwen cast a spell to wake up Yimo when this thought crossed his mind. Yi Shiwen could take the initiative to wake up Yimo, thanks to the growing number of sage tools which Yimo had swallowed. Yi Shiwen no longer needed to wait for him to wake up on his own. However, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have wanted to wake him up as soon as possible if it wasn't important. To be continued. Chapter 5:23. A cold wind was whistling. It had transformed into a freezing astral wind at higher altitudes. The sound of fluttering of clothes echoed in the vicinity. However, Yi Shiwen didn't seem to care as that cold wind blew against his face. In fact, he didn't even use his real elemental energy to block the wind. You are fortunate that you found a dead star colossus. Yimo's voice echoed inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. His voice was still weak. However, his condition had improved a lot after he had swallowed that palisade tool. Yi Shiwen nodded. He agreed with Yimo's point of view. After all, the true Martial University's decline was enough to guess the tyranny of an adult star colossus. Such a star colossus might not appear for 10,000 years. However, it would cause an enormous calamity once it had appeared. Therefore, This was an enormous opportunity for him, even though he had only obtained the dead body of a star colossus. Even the great sage realm experts would go crazy over it. You should be able to recover after you've swallowed the dead body of this star colossus. Yi Shiwen replied. He believed that Yi Mo would rejuvenate by using the exuberant vitality of this star colossus. Indeed, but Yi Mo shook his head and said, "This is an enormous opportunity for you, and it could give you a huge boost. So, it would be extremely unfortunate if I swallowed it." "What are you saying?" Yi Shiwen asked. "This star colossus belongs to the same race as the one that is sealed in the true martial world. But this one is merely an infant." Yi Mo's words left Yi Shiwen speechless. This star colossus had been so dreadful at infancy. So, one couldn't even imagine how dreadful an adult star colossus might be. However, it needed to be mentioned that an adult star colossus appeared as big as a star and used to feed on planets. However, even this one's strength clearly surpasses the great sage realm. Moreover, the blood slave that you control can be used for controlling this star colossus. This star colossus is dead. However, only its soul has been destroyed. Its body is still the same as it was when it was alive. Moreover, I am afraid that its corpse will eventually give birth to a resentful soul if things go on like this, and that would bring an enormous disaster. Yi Mo explained, "Your blood slave has also been condensed from the soul of a star colossus. It displays only a small might at present. However, it could contend against the experts of half-step great sage realm if you integrate it with the star colossus' formidable body. Moreover, your blood slave will eventually enter the half-step great sage realm once it has absorbed the entire soul of the star colossus that is inside the blood pond, and it will be able to contend against the great sage experts when that happens. It will provide you with an enormous amount of protection as a result. In fact, even that Mu Sheng Jie can't harm you if you have the protection of great sage level. Plus, I don't need it urgently. Moreover, I will recover quickly once you have the strength of great sage realm. After all, the level of strength decides whether a matter is difficult or not. A lot of problems can be solved very easily if you have enough strength." Yi Shiwen nodded. He didn't hesitate after he had heard Yi Mo's words. He first made the blood slave try and control the dead body of that star colossus. It could be said that the blood slave was doing the job here. However, Yi Zaiwen's soul was connected to the blood slave. Therefore, it was no different than him doing the job. After this, a pair of huge wings appeared on his back. His wings suddenly fluttered. He transformed into a streamer and disappeared into the horizon. A heaven's pride expert of the meteor sect had died in the heavenly pit. This news should have caused a huge sensation. However, this news had been drowned by the other news that had proliferated from the heavenly pit. The secrets inside the heavenly pit had gradually been dug out along with the arrival of a great number of experts. Even the information about the bereaved had been excavated with the passage of time. It turned out that these ruins belonged to the bereaved Third Eye race. It was reported that the members of the Third Eye race had a third eye on their foreheads. However, the rest of their body was similar to that of humans. One such race had been present among the races which were purged by the meteor sect in the past. Therefore, this news had proliferated even more quickly. It was reported that this was the ancestral land of the Third Eye race. So, this was their foundation place. It had certainly declined. However, there should be many incredible treasures present inside. 3 years' time had passed in a flash. The bereaved were no longer part of rumors alone. Rather, there was conclusive evidence now. In fact, someone had even seen the bereaved people. And it was reported that the high-level experts of the entire meteor sect were extremely concerned because of the appearance of the bereaved. Thus, they had sent a large number of experts here. There was a city outside the heavenly pit. This city had become popular because of the heavenly pit. Hundreds of thousands of people had gathered in this city in a short time, and the majority of them were cultivators. A scholar-looking man was sitting upright on the main seat inside a lively restaurant. Many travel-worn experts had surrounded him. He faintly opened his mouth and said, "You newcomers think that you will find some treasures inside this heavenly pit. However, I will suggest you that it would be better to not provoke some people." The small Jupiter of the meteor sect is an example of such a person. His strength has already entered the half-step great sage realm. It is difficult to find a match for him in the younger generation. In fact, nobody can outmatch him, apart from those old great sage experts. However, almost all the great sage experts in this meteor world belong to the meteor sect. After all, this is their territory. One or two great sage experts may occasionally arrive from outside. However, they don't dare to mess with him either. This is the reason why he has suddenly risen to fame. Of course, how can we dare to provoke the experts of the meteor sect? The small Jupiter had earned his fame long ago. It is said that he will soon enter the great sage realm. How can we provoke someone like him? Yeah, it's best that we don't mess with those people of the meteor sect. Many random cultivators with no background spoke up one after another. Offending the true martial university in the true martial world might not be a big matter. However, offending the meteor sect in the meteor world was akin to courting death. "Isn't there any other ferocious expert apart from him?" someone curiously asked. They had arrived here very recently, so they wanted to know about the situation here. 3 years had passed. However, those who wanted to fish up some gold or who wanted some treasures were still arriving unceasingly. Many people had died inside, and their bodies had been ravaged by the ancient demon beasts. However, there were many who had obtained a lot of benefits in the pit and had soared to the sky after that. Therefore, this place's allure had attracted many people, and they had been arriving here unceasingly. This was probably an example of the saying, seeking riches and honor amidst danger. There's another calamity star apart from the meteor sect's small Jupiter. Nobody knows his name. He usually dresses in green clothes and carries an 8 or 9 years old girl along with him. Everyone calls him the green-clothed traveler. He had become famous after a fight 2 years ago. He had once managed to escape from a great sage expert, and an expert of half-step great sage realm has also died by his hands. He is incomparably dreadful. These two are the most terrifying experts, but there's no need to worry as long as you don't run into them. Of course, you can only blame your fate if you unluckily come across the attack of a great sage expert. That scholar laughed mischievously and said. Everyone nodded. This was true. Great sage realm experts weren't the real danger here. They were certainly very powerful. However, they wouldn't move into action without any reason. After all, those old and sly foxes wouldn't move into action unless they had obtained some concrete information. Therefore, sage experts were the main powerhouses that were active inside the heavenly pit, and these two individuals were the most frightening among them. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of footsteps came from downstairs. It was gentle and in rhythm. A green shadow appeared in front of everyone along with the sound of footsteps. They were surprised to see a handsome young man dressed up in green. He didn't look very outstanding from appearance. However, he seemed aloof. There was a little girl by his side. She was dressed up in a sky-blue long skirt. Her skirt also had silver embroidery on it. Her face looked delicate and pretty. Her complexion looked a bit red. Her eyebrows were slanted, and her mouth was small. A timid expression was hung on her face. She looked approximated 8 or 9 years old. Her long and silver hair was rolled up into 2 knots on the top of her head. 2 silver bangs were softly hanging down over her eyes. They were dangling in a rhythmic fashion. Silver hair. Everyone noticed that this young girl had silver hair. After all, this made her look very peculiar. However, they then noticed that the young man with her was dressed in green clothes. and they immediately remembered the green-clothed traveler that Scholar had told them about. Isn't that? Dresses in green clothes and carries a young girl along. Even that Scholar had held his breath when he had seen them arrive. He had recognized who this person was. It couldn't be anyone else. After all, only that green-clothed traveler could dare to dress up like that. It wasn't that nobody had tried to impersonate him. However, he had quickly found out about those who had done so, and then he had killed them. In fact, he had killed around a dozen impostors in a short span of time. Thus, nobody had dared to impersonate the green-clothed traveler after that. That little girl obviously became a bit timid when she saw so many people around. So, she grabbed that green-clothed traveler's big hand. However, the green-clothed traveler merely looked at the little girl with a faint smile on his face. Then he took her to a table. Everyone held their breaths as they saw these two young individuals, one big and one small. They didn't dare to say anything. Yi Shiwen wasn't too surprised when he noticed that everyone had held their breaths. He merely picked up Xiaoya and made her sit on a chair. The little girl sat there in a cute manner, but she didn't say anything. Yi Shiwen ordered some dishes. The trace of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth under the mask. He had spent these 3 years fighting. More and more people had continued to arrive, since an increasing number of things had been discovered inside the heavenly pit. Moreover, it seemed that the craze for this place wouldn't quieten down in the several decades to come, or even the several hundred years after. This 3 years' time had a very big effect on him. His slightly unstable realm had consolidated and had become stable. He had also made narrow escapes, many times. However, the first one had been the direst of them all. This was when the meteor sect had investigated about Shang Feiyu's death, and Yi Shiwen had attracted the meteor sect's rage because of that. Consequently, they had sent a great sage expert to kill him. He was eventually forced to merge the blood slave with that star colossus, and its fighting strength had increased very drastically as a result. This is why he was able to escape from that great sage expert. That fight had resulted in a bloodbath. Yi Shiwen had escaped after sustaining serious injuries. Moreover, a senior half-step great sage expert of the meteor sect had perished in an instance that had taken place later. He even clashed with the small Jupiter one time, and it had indeed been very terrible. However, it was time to leave. Too many changes had occurred in the last 3 years' time. For example, the Great Wei Empire had already elected a new emperor. To be continued. Chapter 5:24. The second prince, third prince, fourth prince, and the seventh prince had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands, and the big prince had been suppressed as well. Therefore, only the 23rd prince had remained amongst the favorites. So, he had eventually obtained the title of the emperor, and people's expectations had again fallen into his hands. He had ascended the throne 2 years ago. However, not everyone was convinced with his credentials. So, the wood dragon had to come out of the heavenly pit in order to help him in stabilizing his regime. However, Yi Shiwen had decided to wander inside the heavenly pit. In fact, the great sage expert of the Northern Dipper had also searched about for the treasures for several months. However, he hadn't found anything worthwhile here. Therefore, he had left much sooner. Many other great sage experts had also left in a similar fashion. They had certainly found many exotic treasures, but these treasures weren't very useful for them. Otherwise, Yi Shiwen and that small Jupiter wouldn't have been considered as the most ferocious people around. This little girl's name was Xiaoya. Yi Shiwen had met her when she was being chased by some ancient demon beasts. He had rescued her in a very convenient fashion. He had then asked her about how she had gotten there, but she didn't know anything about herself. In fact, it seemed as if her memory had been sealed by someone. She only remembered her name, Xiaoya. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had no choice but to take her along. Fortunately, Xiaoya was exceptionally cute. She never quarreled and never made any noise. In other words, She was far well behaved than that wolf cub. Therefore, he had happily kept her by his side. His cultivation had strengthened enormously in these 3 years. His cultivation of intermediate stage of Sage Realm had consolidated by now, so he could make the breakthrough into the late stage of the Sage Realm at will. It could be estimated that he would be able to contend against the experts of the Sage Great Perfection Realm without the support of the Star Colossus once he had made the breakthrough. Yi Shiwen had disguised himself, and he had even used the restraining breath technique to transform the Star Colossus into a human form. However, too many flaws had remained despite his best efforts. Consequently, he would still be exposed to danger if he were to come across a top expert. It was very important for him to be strong enough to deal with these external forces. He didn't get much time to think, since the food arrived soon after. He obviously didn't need to eat. However, Xiaoya did. So he only observed Xiaoya's gentle and refined movements as she ate. Her small mouth would swallow the food very slowly. However, she was eating at a very quick speed for someone her age. Yi Shiwen was watching someone eating so gently yet with such ferocity for the first time. Xiaoya had soon consumed everything that had been set on the table. She then turned her small face towards Yi Shiwen. She seemingly felt a bit embarrassed, and Yi Shiwen was also left to wonder. How could her small belly pack so much? Yi Shiwen didn't stay once Xiaoya had finished eating. He picked up Xiaoya, transformed into a streamer, and disappeared into the city. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief after both individuals had departed. After all, Yi Zaiwen's deterrent force had affected them very significantly under the shade of the enlightening mind ancient tree. Moreover, they had been discussing about him when he had arrived. Subsequently, they were afraid that he would kill them if he were in a bad mood. The people of the Meteor sect had also received this news. So, they arrived here not long after Yi Shiwen had left. However, they were unaware that Yi Shiwen had already flown off into the space. Where are we going? Xiaoya looked at him and asked in her soft voice. Xiaoya was standing beside Yi Shiwen above the escaping light high up in the sky. The loud astral winds in the upper atmosphere had nearly overshadowed her voice. However, Yi Shiwen had still heard it, since the astral wind couldn't affect his hearing. We're going home. Yi Shiwen gently smiled and replied. He had been wandering for several years now, so he wanted to return. However, he didn't wish to use the Northern Dipper's transmission portals to return. Instead, he wanted to return on his own. He would have to fight Qiao Yiyu in another 10 years. Qiao Yiyu had entered the Sage Great Perfection realm a few years ago, so it wasn't clear to what extent he would have grown after 10 years. Yi Shiwen was no match for him as per his current cultivation. Moreover, the Star Colossus couldn't help him in this case. In fact, he couldn't even reveal it, since it would be too bad for him if the high-level experts found out about it. Moreover, this was his trump card, so he would take out only if he was in a life or death situation. He could only strive to promote himself to the peak of Sage Realm in these 10 years. Only then could he contend against Qiao Yiyu. Not much time was left. Home. This word was very strange for Xiaoya. She didn't remember anything when Yi Shiwen had met her. She didn't even know how she had arrived inside the heavenly pit. The first thing she remembered was that she was trying to hide from those ancient demon beasts that were chasing her. Yes. Yi Shiwen nodded. He had already made a plan. He would make Xiaoya enter the true martial university after their return because he had found out that she possessed dreadful talent. He had met her 1 year ago, and he had taught her the bright jade cultivation technique 6 months ago. This was the technique that he had used for laying his foundation in the past. Who could have imagined that she would make the breakthrough into the Xiantian realm in just 6 months? It had nearly depressed Yi Shiwen to death. He had gone through so many trials in order to make that breakthrough. He alone knew how many dangerous expeditions he had gone on. However, Xiaoya hadn't needed to do anything. she had automatically made the breakthrough into the Xiantian realm. In fact, Yishuin hadn't even given her any medicinal pills for support. He hadn't given her a medicinal pill because she wasn't like him. He could digest those pills with the help of his mysterious space. Those pills could neither have any bizarre effect on him, nor could they shake his foundation. However, the fact that it had worked on him didn't mean that it would work on others as well. So he wanted to make her practice for a few years so that he could observe her and polish her foundation. Who could have imagined that she would improve at such a lightning speed? She had entered the Xiantian realm in just 6 months. Such talent was enough to blow him away. In fact, she was talented enough to shatter the pride of those Heaven's Pride experts. Thus, he had sprouted the plan to make Xiaoye enter the true martial university after his return. However, he wouldn't let her join the Hidden Star Peak. Instead, had have her enlist in some other heritage. After all, the Hidden Star Peak was in an extremely miserable condition. In fact, the entire heritage was in ruins. It could be said that they would have kept on trying to mend the complete version of the Hidden Star scripture generation after generation if Yi Shiwen hadn't mended it for them. It wasn't the time for the university to recruit the disciples. That only happened once in 100 years. However, it wasn't a difficult thing for him to make a person enter the true martial university. This was due to his status of a core disciple as well as a Heaven's Pride expert. In fact, it would be a piece of cake for him. Moreover, people would always welcome such a genius with open arms. It had been a grand occasion for Yi Shiwen when he was in Yi Yuan School, and the true martial university had opened its gates to recruit new disciples. After all, it was a once-in-a-century event. Therefore, he had put his entire effort to get recruited. However, putting someone through the admission process was nothing more than a slight show of strength and status for the current Yi Shiwen. His status and strength had changed. So had his vision. Ants on the ground can never see the eagles hovering in the sky. Let's go, Yi Shiwen stated in a loud voice. Then he suddenly accelerated the speed of his flying light. He tore his way through the vast sky and flew out of the meteor world's atmosphere. What the hell is this place? Yi Shiwen was in the void. He was standing above a desolate planet. There was nothing in sight. The starry space was spread as far as he could see. He had arrived in this section of space after flying for 3 months since he had left the meteor world. However, he had been wandering here for 1 month now, and he still couldn't get out of this starry space. Hallucinatory star field. Yi Shiwen checked in his star atlas and exclaimed. He had gotten hold of the Northern Dipper's top secret star atlas. The star atlas stated that this star region was known as the hallucinatory star field because it was very difficult to travel through this section of the space. The space was overlapping, and there were many natural transmission portals lying around. Therefore, one might end up passing through one of these natural transmission portals if one weren't careful. Consequently, one would be sent back to the beginning of the region. This place wasn't as dangerous as some other parts of the space. However, many people had gotten trapped here and had eventually died. Yi Shiwen shouldn't have needed these many days to cross this place, since he had sage realm cultivation. Moreover, he also had deployed his demon wings. However, he had still been wandering in this region for 1 month now. Xiao Yu was cutely standing beside him. She didn't say anything. She merely raised her small face and looked at Yi Shiwen. She seldom spoke. In fact, she wouldn't have uttered a single word in this 1 month if Yi Shiwen hadn't asked her to. Let's go and have a look. Yi Shiwen had detected some fluctuations. They had seemingly resulted from a fight that was happening far away. The fluctuations were very fine since they had transmitted from far away. However, he had still detected them, and he had become excited because the people who were fighting could turn out to be some acquaintances, and they could possibly guide him out of this place if that were the case. Yi Shiwen had only flown forward for a moment when he saw that dozens of people were closely sticking together inside a boundless star field, and they were surrounded by several hundred star beasts. Damn it! How have we landed into a group of star beasts? It's not like our clan has arrived at this hallucinatory star field for the first time. In fact, we already knew that these star beasts inhabit this region. So, how could we land into their group by mistake? The people of Li Clan must have been responsible for this. An expert who appeared to be in his 30s bitterly spoke up as he brandished a blade towards those star beasts. His cultivation had already entered the initial stage of the sage realm. His blade carried extraordinary might. However, these star beasts were even more ferocious. In fact, more than 1/3 of them were at the sage realm. Therefore, he had slowly been forced to retreat, even though he was strong. Concentrate on them and don't complain. What's the use of saying these things at this time? First, we need to get out of here. Only then can we settle the debt with those bastards. A middle-aged man spoke up at this time. He stood beside that seemingly 30-year-old expert. Yi Shiwen was surprised to see his robust, tall figure. He was waving his spear as if it were a dragon. Those star beasts screamed and transformed into blood fog wherever that spear went. His cultivation made it seem as if he had entered sage, small perfection realm long ago. So, a single blow from his spear was enough to kill one of those star beasts of initial stage of sage realm. Moreover, it could conveniently kill a large number of those semi-sage level star beasts as well. This battle had transformed into a bloodbath. Both sides had suffered a disastrous number of casualties. Therefore, the star beasts that had surrounded them suddenly withdrew. They no longer encircled them. Those experts relaxed to some extent after those star beasts had retreated. They promptly sat down cross-legged in the space and began to meditate in order to restore the energy inside their bodies. The richer ones among them used medicinal pills to restore their energy. Medicinal pills were precious. However, it was more important to preserve life at such a dangerous place. "Who is there?" That spear-wielding, middle-aged man shouted at this time. His knife-like, sharp vision swept inside the void. "Don't worry. We mean no harm." Two figures slowly appeared in the space. To be continued. Chapter 5:25. Don't worry. We mean no harm. Two figures slowly appeared in the space. A tall figure, dressed up in green, appeared in front of everyone. There was another short figure with him. This silhouette wore blue clothes. Everyone let out a sigh of relief when they noticed that this man's cultivation was only at the intermediate stage of the sage realm. So, they didn't need to worry, even if this man harbored malice. After all, what could an insignificant expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm do? A dozen or so individuals in this group were at the intermediate stage of the sage realm. Some of them were also at the late stage of the sage realm. Moreover, some were even at the peak stage of the sage realm. That middle-aged man was at the sage, small, complete realm. In fact, an expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm posed no threat to him, even though he had sustained serious injuries. "Who are you?" the middle-aged man asked. He felt somewhat alienated from these two individuals. However, he wasn't very vigilant. What could an insignificant expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm do? He could suppress him with a flick of his hand. "We are travelers. My younger sister and I have accidentally arrived in the hallucinatory star field. Now, we can't find a way out of this place. We don't know if we can get out of here on our own. Can you take us along with you so that we can leave this place? It will be a big favor on us." Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in gratitude and said, "Taking you along with us isn't an issue. However, you've also seen that we've perhaps been trapped by someone. We're already in the borderline zone of the hallucinatory star field. However, we may come across an unavoidable, deadly fight at any time. And it won't be good if you were to come to harm because of us. So, you must give it a proper thought first." The middle-aged man smiled and explained the situation in a straightforward manner. Villa Lord, you mustn't do this. Villa Lord, you mustn't do this. God knows if the Li clan may have sent these people. We may possibly get exposed if we take them along with us, and we may have to face an endless number of star beasts if that's the case. Consequently, it would become very difficult for us to find the green-scaled fruit for sister-in-law. The man who had used the blade promptly stepped forward and spoke up. The voice of the middle-aged man hadn't even faded when many of the other experts started attempting to dissuade him in quick succession. It was evident that they were extremely careful. They were afraid that Yi Shiwen could be an enemy spy or what not. "I have already made up my mind," the middle-aged man firmly said. "We have already lost many young brothers in our quest for the green-scaled fruit. How can I, Yan Hong Yi, lose any more of our young brothers because of my family's affair? Villa Lord, we are doing this willingly. Even the brothers who have died would have no complaints. Sister-in-law treats us so well. She doesn't look down on us because of our lowly background. We shall not give up, no matter what," that blade wielder firmly replied. "Shut up. Do you wish to lose all of our brothers here?" Yan Hong Yi, the middle-aged man, chided him. "I've decided to plunder the great building. I've also heard that someone had once found the green-scaled fruit inside the great building. It's still much better than trying to find a needle in a haystack inside this hallucinatory star field." Yi Shiwen started to admire Yan Hong Yi as he heard his words. He had seen so many cold-blooded leaders who had never hesitated in putting the lives of their subordinates in danger for their own aim. In fact, leaders were callous and cold-hearted. Therefore, it was rare to come across an affectionate leader like Yan Hong Yi. Yan Hong Yi was extremely majestic. That blade wielder was very reluctant to give up. However, he couldn't disobey Yan Hong Yi's words after Yan Hong Yi had scolded him. Yan Hong Yi saw that everyone was reluctant. However, they didn't dare to go against his words either. He turned around towards Yi Shiwen and said, "I'm sorry. This family drama must have amused you. There's nothing to pardon. The righteousness of the Villa Lord has only made me admire you even more." Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and stated. Yan Hong Yi sighed and said, "I am Yan Hong Yi, the Villa Lord of the Puyuan Villa that lies in the jurisdiction of Shangyang City. And these are my younger brothers. I am Yi Shiwen. It's nice to meet you, Villa Lord Yan. And this is my little sister, Xiaoya." Yi Shiwen gave the introduction. "We would be troubling you for a little while, Villa Lord Yan." No problem at all. Young brother Yi, you are most welcome. It's not a big thing. We will go forward once we've tidied up here." Yan Hong Yi smiled and said in a straightforward manner. He then turned around and ordered everyone to collect the corpses of those star beasts. These were top-notch materials. Moreover, many of the wounded individuals required some care. Everyone's working speed was very quick. They were acting in harmony and were showing mutual understanding and coordination. It was obvious that they weren't doing this for the first time. So, everyone knew that they must pack up as soon as possible. Else, the smell of blood might attract other greedy star beasts. These people were used to drifting aimlessly in the space. It was hard to tell how superior their skills were in these matters in front of an amateur like Yi Shiwen. "Our Villa Lord is kind that he has offered you shelter. You had better not be a spy of the Li clan. Otherwise, you are done for." The blade wielder flew over to Yi Shiwen and warned him in a cold manner. His fierce expression scared Xiaoya as she stood beside Yi Shiwen. So, she slightly retreated from her current position. She was visibly somewhat scared. Yi Shiwen frowned. He didn't like this. However, he didn't attack. He must get out of this hallucinatory star field with the help of these people. Anyway, he would part ways with them after he'd gotten out of the star field. So, there would be no dispute afterwards. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had noticed that this blade-wielding man had a bad attitude. However, he had also realized that this man was thinking about the well-being of his Puyuan villa. Yi Shiwen certainly didn't like his attitude, but he couldn't say that he hated it either. The blade wielder went to help other people in clearing the stuff after he had warned Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked at Xiaoya with a calm and gentle expression in his eyes. It seems like someone is targeting this team. Yi Shiwen had caught this information from the conversation between these people. However, it didn't bother him. He would merely take out the corpse of the Star Colossus, and he would death slap anyone who had tried to cause him trouble. In fact, this would hold true as long as he didn't come across a great sage expert. Moreover, he was confident that he would manage to escape even if a great sage expert were to attack. The blood slave had become increasingly proficient at controlling the Star Colossus. So, Yi Shiwen had stopped making it come out of the Star Colossus body. Yi Shiwen simply made the blood slave reside in the body of the Star Colossus and had been slowly transforming into its soul. This had indeed been a very big help for him. Yi Shiwen had averted disaster many times in these last 3 years' expeditions because the blood slave was controlling the Star Colossus. The blood slave would be able to unleash the full potential of this Star Colossus once it would completely transform into the soul of this Star Colossus. Then, even the great sage experts wouldn't be a problem anymore. Of course, this would happen after many, many years. The people of the Piyuan villa cleared up the corpses rather quickly. Yan Hong Yi took out a ship-shaped divine tool after everyone had cleared up the area. It was a pseudo-sage tool that was used for sailing in space. However, it was good enough for moving faster. Everyone went aboard the ship. The ship then transformed into a streamer of light and shuttled in the universe. Yi Shiwen was standing on the deck of this large ship. He realized that this ship was moving at such a high speed that he couldn't even feel the outside. Moreover, it was sailing so smoothly that it seemed as if it was treading on level ground. He had never ridden on a speed-type divine tool because he was a lone operator. Moreover, he also had a magical power like the devil wings. Also, he had never seen a divine tool that could catch up with his sage realm speed. However, he felt that he required a similar speed-type divine tool that could fly. This was because he had a little girl along with him now. Young brother Yi, don't mind that Hu Angguo's words. That guy is always like that, but he doesn't have bad intentions. Yan Hong Yi walked up to Yi Zaiwen's side and said, "It appeared that there was no need to worry about driving the ship. One only needed to input the route in such flying divine tools. These tools could then fly on autopilot mode." Yi Shiwen smiled. He knew that Yan Hong Yi was referring to the person who had come to warn him a while ago. However, he didn't care about it either. After all, his temper would go out of hand in his lifetime if something like this would start to bother him. "It's all right," Yi Shiwen laughed. "It doesn't matter. Where does young brother Yi come from and where is he headed?" Yan Hong Yi asked. "I have come from the meteor world, and I haven't decided where I wish to go, so I can go anywhere." "Ha ha." Yi Shiwen laughed and replied. He hadn't decided where he wanted to go. He could go to any place that would come along the way as long as he was traveling in the direction of the true martial world. It would obviously depend upon the situation at the time. However, he hadn't thought about any particular place that he wanted to go to. "Young brother, ye might as well visit our Piyuan villa, since he hasn't decided where he wishes to go." Yan Hong Yi smiled and said. He looked at Xiaoya. He was indeed straightforward and generous. However, he was no fool. He had showed special fondness towards Yi Shiwen and had hitched him a ride. However, it wasn't that he had made this decision in a casual manner. After all, he was the leader of a force, and the survival of this force depended on his actions. So, he could take this force to hell if he wasn't careful. He had favored Yi Shiwen because of Xiaoya. He had never seen someone with such a pure bearing. She was as pure as a baby. She was without the slightest bit of contamination. Someone with such a pure mind could instinctively judge who was good and who was bad. After all, no amount of disguise could conceal one's malice from an infant. And Xiaoya was so close to Yi Shiwen. This showed that Yi Shiwen wasn't a bad person. This was the reason why he had allowed Yi Shiwen to come aboard the ship, and he believed that his judgment couldn't be wrong. After all, he hadn't been the leader of this force for so many years for nothing. He must have some ability to make good judgments. Yi Shiwen obviously didn't know what was inside Yan Hongyi's mind. However, he became very excited because of this invitation. The so-called man is alive when he walks on the most dangerous roads, eats the best delicacies, has the most beautiful woman, fights the most powerful enemies, makes friends with the heroes who deserve his friendship, and does what he loves to do. And Yi Shiwen believed that a man like Yan Hongyi was undoubtedly worthy of his friendship. Well, how can I refuse if the elder brother has invited me? Yi Shiwen smiled back. Anyway, he hadn't decided where he wanted to go, so he could easily go with the flow for now. Good. You're very frank and straightforward. Yan Hongyi admired Yi Shiwen when he saw that Yi Shiwen was neither timid nor fake. To be continued. Chapter 5:26. A plus A. Chapter 5:26. Assists in the fight. Bang! The ship was flying with a fast speed when it suddenly began to shake violently. It seemed as if it had met with a huge impact. Villa Lord, it's not good. Several hundred star beasts have appeared in front. A man suddenly came tumbling out from the crowd. Everyone looked on and found that several hundred star beasts had surrounded the ship. Moreover, each of them was as big as a hill. They looked like the magnified versions of fierce wolves. Their entire bodies were covered with silver fur, and that silver fur was glowing in this dark universe. There were innumerable, and these hundreds of beasts had tightly contained them in the space. Damn it, they found us. Yan Hongyi's complexion turned unsightly as he said these words. A dreadful aura soared into the sky from the middle of these star beasts group. Then, a fierce mountain-sized wolf slowly appeared in front of everyone. Fierce Star Wolf King. Everyone's complexion turned deathly pale when they saw this monster. They even forgot about those other hill-sized fierce star wolves. There was usually a certain relation between height and strength. However, it didn't necessarily mean that one was going to be insanely powerful because one had a big stature. However, this fierce Star Wolf King had truly frightened them. It had already surpassed the peak of the Sage Realm, and was currently at the Sage Small Perfection Realm, and this had scared them out of their wits. Yan Hongyi was the strongest among the people of the Piyuan Villa. He was at the Sage Small Perfection Realm. However, he would have to put everything at stake while fighting this Wolf King. Obviously, it wouldn't be that easy since this Wolf King's ominous energy had gone off the charts. The outcome of a fight between a fierce beast and human expert of the same realm would be difficult to predict. Some experts would win, while others would lose rather tragically. This varied from person to person. There were some geniuses who possessed the power to crush opponents belonging to the same realm. It wouldn't have been a very difficult thing to deal with this fierce Starwolf King for such a genius. After all, they possessed superb divine tools, outstanding cultivation, and an ancient heritage. So, their attacks were far more powerful than those of their peers. However, it wasn't that easy for ordinary people. They neither possessed powerful divine tools, nor did they have formidable martial arts roots. Moreover, they didn't even have a solid foundation. Consequently, even a group of 3 such individuals would be unable to defeat a fierce beast of the same realm. Finally arrived? Yi Shiwen muttered. He shot a glance towards that powerful-looking, fierce Starwolf King. Then he looked at Xiaoya with a smile of reassurance. After all, she didn't need to worry as long as he was there with her. However, he didn't know that Xiaoya wasn't worried. Her complexion had remained unchanged. She had faced all kinds of situations ever since she had tagged with Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if she felt that there was no need to worry as long as Yi Shiwen was by her side. Brothers, we are in this predicament because of me. So it is my duty to go and engage that fierce Starwolf King. Meanwhile, you guys must look for an opportunity to escape. Yan Hongyi took out a spear, grinned, and said these words. The look in his eyes made it seem that he didn't find himself to be a match for these star beasts. Villa Lord, let's go together. We aren't afraid of death. These star beasts have surrounded us. How can we escape? So let's go together. We mustn't let these lowly beasts ridicule us, even if we die. These star beasts had long been wise and clever. This was because they possessed spiritual intelligence. Their battle formation resembled that of a battalion of soldiers. They had already surrounded them from all directions. Moreover, their encirclement seemed to be impenetrable. Come with me. I will go and engage that fierce Star Wolf King. Come to give me backup if you guys manage to kill those other fierce wolves in time. We still have a chance of survival. Yan Hong didn't resist any further. After all, he knew that his previous plan was hopeless. Moreover, there was only a slim chance of survival, and that too only if they went all out to hold their own against these beasts. Young brother Yi, I'm sorry that I've dragged you into this. I shouldn't have done that. You must take off with little sister as soon as you get the opportunity. Yan Hong said, Relax. I have a plan. Yi Shiwen replied. However, he felt that many of the people of Piyuan Villa that surrounded him were looking at him with bad intentions. He deliberated a bit, and understood that these people were suspecting him of being a spy of the Li clan, just as Huangwa had earlier suspected him. They felt that it couldn't be a coincidence that they had come across these many fierce beasts after a mysterious person had come aboard their ship. It was also probable that he was the one who had attracted these beasts. Yi Shiwen merely smiled. After all, everything would become clear from the outcome of his actions at this juncture. Howl! Everyone was still discussing here, but that fierce Star Wolf King couldn't wait anymore. So it howled loudly, and its howl shook the entire world. The void collapsed, and a huge black crack spread out wherever the sound waves from its howl went. Then, the huge crack spread out towards the ship. Humph! Yan Hong coldly snorted. He advanced and arrived at the front of the ship. He pointed his spear towards the vast emptiness, and a boundless ripple proliferated and scattered in the vast space. Then, that ripple suddenly collided with that huge crack. Bang! A vast chunk of the void collapsed under the suppression force. The fight between two senior experts of the sage, small perfection realm had barely begun. However, it had already shaken the entire world. Everyone's expressions had turned serious. The first clash was enough to determine that this Star Wolf King was much more tyrannical than they had previously imagined. The Star Wolf King's loud howl stirred up the flock of fierce wolves, and their eyes turned red. Their claws dug into the space and split open deep black cracks in the void. Howl! The fierce Star Wolf King let out a loud howl like a sonic boom. Those fierce wolves also looked upward and held one after another. They had launched a long-range raid towards the ship by doing so. The long-range raid of each of those small hill-sized beasts was overwhelming. The void shook as they approached with a scary momentum. It seemed as if violent waves were causing turbulence in an ocean. Die! The people of the Piyuan Villa also roared as they rushed out to face those fierce starwolves. Bang! The seemingly endless horde of the fierce starwolves suddenly collided with the matrix formation that was protecting the ship. 1/3 of the matrix formation was destroyed in a flash. This was inevitable since these fierce starwolves were too many in number. Even the ship's protective layer couldn't endure such a massive impact. However, the semi-sage level fierce wolves were instantly turned into ashes by the barrier. Yi Zaiwen's expression had also turned stern. The real fight was about to begin. The ominous aura of the enemy penetrated through the void and blew against his face. This was a true battle. Be a good girl and stay on the ship until I return. All right. Yi Shiwen looked at Xiaoya and spoke after everyone had left the ship. Xiao Yu was only at the Xiantian small perfection realm at present. Her cultivation speed was extremely quick. However, she couldn't travel in the space by herself. Moreover, she could die here because there was no air in this place. This was her vulnerability and nothing could be done about it. Earlier, Yi Shiwen was there to protect her. However, he would have to engage in the battle now. He couldn't dare to say that he could protect her out there, at least not with confidence. Therefore, it was better to make her stay on the ship. Okay, Xiao Yi softly replied. She was a very clever kid. Yan Hong Yi had already started to clash with that fierce Star Wolf King. His spear was waving like a dragon. It devoured a vast chunk of space as it rushed towards that fierce Star Wolf King. Yan Hong Yi didn't hold back. His entire real elemental energy suddenly burst out of his body with an incredible spear beam. Howl! The fierce Star Wolf King opened its large mouth as if it were a sacrificial bull. A dreadful spirit energy fluctuated and burst out of its mouth. The terrifying cannon beam traveled through the void and collided with Yan Hong Yi's spear beam. Bang! Two great powerhouses had begun to clash, and this resulted in crackling sounds being produced. The scene looked exceptionally stunning. The clash of their dreadful powers resulted in energy waves from the point of the collision. Those energy waves then swept all across, and they shattered the space wherever they went. The fierce Star Wolf King issued an angry howl, and its silver fur began to glow golden. Then it dug its claws into the space, bolted forward explosively, and transformed into a golden streamer. It arrived in front of Yan Hong Yi in an instant. Yan Hong Yi hadn't thought that this fierce Star Wolf King would have such incredible speed. He hadn't even gotten any time to react, but it had already arrived in front of him. However, he couldn't retreat. That's because his whole team would collapse if he were to fall back. He could only clench his teeth and prepare for battle. He brandished his spear and suddenly trampled the void under his feet. Then he darted forward like a rolling mountain to crush that approaching golden light. Boom! The boundless collision issued dreadful energy waves. The void shook and cracks that resembled a spider's web spread out. A tremendous energy wave swirled about violently, and a figure was sent flying by that shock wave. It was Yan Hong Yi. Yan Hong Yi felt a strange taste in his mouth. He was about to spout a mouthful of blood. However, he knew that he couldn't spout blood at this. After all, his power would suffer a heavy loss if he did that. Therefore, he forcibly swallowed the blood essence. Consequently, his face turned an unusually dark shade of red. Moreover, he was forced to retreat over a dozen meters before he was able to break his momentum. These human experts were undoubtedly weaker when compared to these fierce beasts. Therefore, fighting with these fierce beasts was akin to courting death for a majority of these human experts. However, that wasn't true for a freak like Yi Shiwen. The fierce star wolves weren't considered among the top-notch star beasts. Nonetheless, their ferocity and instincts far surpassed that of humans. However, the human experts had one advantage over these fierce beasts. They possessed intelligence. They could use tools, divine tools, talismans, and whatnot. Only these things made the human experts eligible to contend against these fierce beasts. Yan Hong Yi was an old expert of the society, so he obviously knew this fact very well. However, he didn't have any other method at this time. Moreover, he couldn't retreat. He could only drag time since he had to hold up until the people of the Piyuan Villa had killed those other fierce beasts. They could then help him escape, or they could provide him with backup. He would obviously have more room to choose then. Howl! The eyes of the Silver Wolf King had turned red. Moreover, there was an ominous glint in them. The Wolf King issued a thunderous howl once again. Its claws suddenly grabbed the void and issued a metal clanging sound. It opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl once again. Endless spirit energies suddenly gathered, and another spirit energy cannon beam was ejected, but not towards Yan Hong Yi. Instead, it was directed towards the ship. This Silver Wolf King was sentient and had already acquired spiritual intelligence. So, it had obviously made out that these human experts wouldn't be able to escape without their ship. In fact, they would be sitting ducks. Yi Zaiwen's exceptional flying magical power was extremely rare. The majority of human experts didn't have a divine tool they could use for flying away. Consequently, their flying speeds were no match for those of these demon beasts. It's not good. Damn it. Yan Hong stopped minding the Silver Wolf King for the time being. However, it was already too late for him to stop this attack that was going towards the ship. However, a frightening sword rainbow dropped from above at this time. To be continued. Chapter 5:27. A plus A. Chapter 5:27 astonishes everyone. Bang! The sword energy fell down from above and exploded with incredible energy fluctuations. The entire space disintegrated under the crushing suppression of the sword energy. Yan Hong was left in a state of shock by this sudden assistance. However, he soon found out that this unexpected helper was none other than Yi Shiwen. It was that young man whom he had never taken seriously. You must quickly run away. This is a demon beast of the sage, small perfection realm. You're no match for it. Yan Hong promptly shouted. Yi Shiwen merely grinned in reply. Yan Hong was still asking him to run away. This was a rare occurrence. In fact, any other person would have sacrificed the helper's life to save their own. On the ship, Xiaoya looked serene as she witnessed Yi Zaiwen's aura. It had become even more tyrannical with the passage of time. An overbearing energy was raging inside Yi Zaiwen's slim figure. Hu Ongua was staring blankly at Yi Shiwen. In fact, he looked embarrassed. After all, he hadn't expected Yi Shiwen to act like this. Therefore, he was very surprised that the person who had saved their ship had turned out to be Yi Shiwen, the same man whom he had doubted earlier. Consequently, he was forced to reconsider his opinion of Yi Shiwen. The expression in Yi Zaiwen's eyes had condensed, and his pupils looked profound. It seemed as if the birth and destruction of the universe was taking place within his eyes. Howl! The fierce Starwolf King howled once again. An ominous and severe energy began to surge inside its body. Its eyes were red. It suddenly trod with its claws, and it seemed as if the void beneath its claws had been ripped apart. Then it quickly drilled through the void and pounced towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen shot his fist in retaliation. It transformed into a huge star and swept down. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist suddenly pounded the body of the fierce Starwolf King. A terrifying explosion resounded as a result. In fact, it seemed as if this sound had originated from the collision between two planets, and boundless energy waves swept across. How is this possible? He blocked that fierce Starwolf King by using his fist. How the hell is this possible? He is using his body to contend against this massive beast. Am I dreaming or something? Everyone was stunned when they saw this scene unfold before their eyes. After all, they believed that an average human expert couldn't contend against a demon beast. A human expert needed to have those divine tools, talismans, and whatnot if they wanted to contend against a demon beast. Moreover, it would be difficult to confront a demon beast king even if one were to use divine tools. In fact, a human expert could contend against a demon beast king of the same realm only if one were to be at the pinnacle among human experts of that realm. However, he was fighting that fierce Starwolf King barehanded, and it seemed as if he hadn't even gone all out yet. But the thing that had surprised them the most was that Yi Shiwen wasn't the one who had been sent flying away because of that explosion. Instead, it had been that fierce Starwolf King. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist transformed into a huge star and pounded the tip of that fierce Starwolf King's nose. That fierce Starwolf King went flying upside down, and its blood started to splash out. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they witnessed this scene. Yi Shiwen had struck the tip of that fierce Starwolf King's nose. It was the weakest part of a star beast's body. However, even the weakest part of Star Beast's body was as hard as iron. What kind of a monster was Yi Shiwen to be able to pull this off? Everyone was staring blankly at Yi Shiwen, and Yan Hongyi was no exception. He had been greatly shocked by this scene, and remained speechless for a long time. Moreover, he had also become a bit depressed. After all, he had tried his best against this demon beast, but he had failed to fend it off even then. However, Yi Shiwen had done that easily, and that too whilst being unarmed. Villa Lord Yen, thanks for letting us get aboard your ship. I have nothing to repay you with. So, I will deal with this beast for you as a means to show my gratitude. Yi Shiwen looked at Yan Hongyi and spoke up. Perhaps it wasn't a big deal for Yan Hongyi to take Yi Shiwen along with him. However, it was a very big deal for Yi Shiwen. He was confident that he wouldn't have stayed trapped in this place forever. However, he might have had to waste a year's time, or even more, in order to escape this place if he hadn't met Yan Hongyi and his crew. And he obviously didn't wish to waste so much time. Similarly, it was no big deal for Yi Shiwen to deal with this monster. However, it was a life-saving grace for Yan Hongyi. Yi Shiwen didn't pay heed to Yan Hongyi after he had finished speaking. Instead, he shifted his attention towards that fierce Starwolf King. It had become even more violent after sustaining injuries at the hands of Yi Shiwen. The hair on its body had stood up and transformed into spikes. In fact, it looked like a hedgehog when inverted. However, nobody dared to underestimate it. After all, its hair could inflict a fatal wound. "Arrogant brat!" the fierce Starwolf King roared. It couldn't conceal the violent look in its eyes as it suddenly rushed out. Its massive body rushed over with the crushing power and pressure of a giant mountain that was rolling over. "Thousand stars, tyrant palm!" Yi Shiwen shouted. His vision was locked on that fierce Starwolf King. A big hand stretched out, and 1,000 palm shadows suddenly appeared in the sky. They then transformed into 1,000 meteors in the universe, and rushed towards the fierce Starwolf King. Bang! 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 Those meteors fell from above in quick succession, and pounded the body of that fierce Starwolf King. A loud, metal, clanging sound echoed in the vicinity as a result. The skin of this fierce Starwolf King was supposed to be invulnerable. Even a divine tool couldn't injure it. Even Yan Hongyi hadn't been able to contend against it with a sage tool in his hand. However, Yi Shiwen was different. His tyrant body had reached the 7th layer. Its might had reached a dreadful height. Every palm attack and every fist attack of his was like a giant mountain that could cut off a 1,000-mile-long river. It was incomparably dreadful. The meteors in this 1,000 stars tyrant palm were the embodiments of his heavy fist blows. Therefore, every meteor had gorged out a huge chunk of flesh from the body of that fierce Starwolf King. The body of that fierce Starwolf was supposed to be incredibly powerful, but it had soon turned into a complete mess. It had gotten badly mutilated and had been drenched in blood. The fierce Starwolf King couldn't advance because of the continuous bombardment of Yi Shiwen's 1,000 stars tyrant palm. Therefore, it couldn't come close to Yi Shiwen. In fact, it had been forced to retreat because of the barrage of attacks. On the contrary, the protective layer of demon elemental energy couldn't protect it anymore. In fact, the protective layer was receding unceasingly. The fierce Starwolf King had been forced into a difficult situation by Yi Shiwen's attacks. However, it wasn't scared. On the contrary, it became even fiercer, and its ominous power swept in all directions. It suddenly broke the space and appeared in front of Yi Shiwen. Its tail swept out towards him. Its tail was the hardest part of its body. An ordinary expert would be cut into 2 halves if its tail struck them. Yi Shiwen stretched out his hands and grabbed that tail. Bang! His arms trembled. The fierce Starwolf King had used its entire strength. An average person's entire arm would have torn off if they were in Yi Shiwen's place. However, even the web between Yi Shiwen's fingers hadn't been ruptured. His arms had merely trembled a bit at first. However, he managed to grab that tail properly after that. Then he suddenly threw the beast away. Bang! Yi Shiwen threw away the fierce Star-Wolf King. It went out flying and crashed into a meteor. The meteor shattered and gave rise to a small mushroom cloud of dust. He's fighting with that Star Beast King with his bare hands. Everyone was left thunderstruck as they witnessed this scene. They had thought that Yi Shiwen was overestimating himself. After all, he had dared to put his body at risk by fighting with that Star Beast. Wasn't that akin to courting death? However, they weren't thinking so anymore. Moreover, they had realized that Yi Shiwen was a monster in comparison to that fierce Star-Wolf King. In fact, they had never seen someone fighting barehanded against a Star Beast. Stunningly, Yi Ziven had dominated that Star Beast since the beginning of the fight. In fact, it seemed as if he was toying with it. They had even forgotten that they too had a Star Beast opponent to fight. However, even those other Star Beasts were dumbfounded at this time. After all, their leader was like a god to them. But their leader had unexpectedly been forced into a disadvantageous position by a human in a clash of physical strength. This thing was simply beyond their wildest imaginations. The fierce Star Wolves didn't have the strongest body among the Star Beasts. However, their not-so-powerful physical constitution was still very powerful when compared to that of human experts. It was their key strength. However, even this key strength had failed to manifest itself in front of Yi Shiwen. Both sides reacted quickly and engaged in the deadly battle once again. The body of the fierce Star-Wolf King had been badly mutilated by Yi Ziwen's attacks this time. The Star-Wolf King even felt a little dizzy. Moreover, its fierce eyes were no longer blood-red. They had instead regained their normal shade. It was initially going berserk due to being pushed by some secret method. However, it had been bombarded several times and had been sent flying here and there. So, the effects of that secret method had finally worn off, and it had come back to its senses as a result. Moreover, it had finally realized that this slim man before its eyes was way too ferocious, and it didn't have the power to defeat this man. It's over, Yi Shiwen softly exclaimed. He took the initiative to attack this time, and he suddenly trod on the golden waves. His figure swept forward in a flash. Nobody could see him since their eyes couldn't keep up with his speed. This felt like the legendary magical power as mentioned in the fables. It was said that one could compress the earth with a thumb with the help of this power. Yi Shiwen arrived in front of that fierce Star-Wolf King in the blink of an eye amidst the flashes of golden light. The inverting ocean seal condensed instantaneously. It gathered endless spirit energies from all around, and then condensed above Yi Ziwen's head. He raised his hands, and it seemed as if he had lifted a boundless ocean. He looked like that legendary figure mentioned in the fables that had lifted the heavens for countless years. "Ha!" Yi Shiwen shouted loudly, and the boundless ocean poured down at once. Its dreadful weight suppressed and broke down the void. It transformed into a huge seal midway, and swept down with a crushing force. It might have taken a lot of time to describe what was happening. However, everything had happened in a split second. The speed of Yi Ziwen's seal attack was incredibly quick. He had manifested and unleashed the inverting ocean seal in an instant, and it had pounded that fierce Star-Wolf King immediately after. Moreover, the fierce Star-Wolf King was still feeling confused and disoriented when the inverting ocean seal came down upon him. Bang! A loud explosion sounded. The fierce Star-Wolf King was minced by the inverting ocean seal. The heavenly source mirror slowly emitted scarlet light within Yi Ziwen's body, and the body and essence of the fierce Star-Wolf King was absorbed by the heavenly source mirror along with its most important part, the demon core. The heavenly source mirror had become much more powerful than it was 3 years ago. After all, it had recovered a lot during Yi Ziwen's 3 years of expeditions. It won't be too long before the heavenly source mirror recovers. Yi Shiwen said in his heart. We've luckily survived this time, thanks to young brother Yi. It's a huge favor. I don't have words to thank you. Cuckoo. Yan Hongyi coughed as he arrived beside Yi Shiwen. He then patted his shoulder and said, To be continued. Chapter 528. A plus A, Chapter 528. Talking nonsense can get a person killed. It's nothing. It's not a big deal. Yi Shiwen smiled. It truly wasn't a big thing for him. Fighting demon beasts was much simpler than fighting complex and cunning humans. One merely needed strength to crush the beasts. In fact, one would have the power to crush these beasts if one had great strength, real elemental energy, and other such things. And Yi Shiwen had gained an upper hand in all these aspects. The legends stated that the main objective of his tyrant body secret was to go on expeditions against devils and gods. Therefore, dealing with these demon beasts must be very easy for him. It wasn't difficult to deal with demon beasts after having an upper hand in all these aspects. In fact, dealing with human experts was much more difficult than dealing with these beasts. After all, the human experts had much more than formidable strength alone. They also had all kinds of divine tools, talismans, and whatnot in abundance. Therefore, Yi Shiwen felt that it was much more difficult to deal with human experts. Cuckoo! Yan Hongyi suddenly coughed once again. Blood also came out from his mouth along with the coughing. His complexion had turned pale. Are you all right? Yi Shiwen promptly asked. I'm fine. It's nothing. It's just old injuries. They've resurfaced due to my fight with that beast. Plus, I've also sustained some new injuries in that fight. I'm all right. Hey, I'm getting old. These injuries wouldn't have had any effect on me if I had been young. Yan Hongyi waved his hand. He smiled reluctantly and used his martial power to suppress the injuries. Yi Shiwen didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Getting old? What kind of a joke was it? An expert would become more and more powerful as their cultivation deepened with age. Consequently, an older expert would possess more powerful vitality and vigor than the younger ones. Unless they were on the verge of death, those remaining star beasts couldn't escape and were killed very quickly with Yi Shiwen's assistance. Moreover, the team hadn't suffered huge losses since Yi Shiwen had killed that fierce Star Wolf King in time. Everyone's opinion of Yi Shiwen had also changed. They hadn't liked him initially. They had arrived here in the hallucinatory star field with the determination to lay down their lives. These chosen people of the villa were second to none. After all, the villa had so many experts, and Yi Shiwen was merely at the intermediate stage of the sage realm. So, what could he have possibly achieved? However, they were amazed after they witnessed Yi Shiwen's strength. They were trying to avoid making eye contact with Yi Shiwen at the moment. After all, they had said that he might be a spy of the Li clan, so they couldn't say anything to redeem themselves at this time. After all, they could only say that they had been rather unfair towards him so far. However, they were also feeling a bit relieved. They would be at ease even if the Li clan played some trick now. After all, they had a formidable expert like Yi Shiwen to keep watch. Their safety factor had enormously increased since they had two sage, small perfection level experts to keep watch now. Everyone's behavior towards Yi Shiwen had changed enormously after this matter. Fortunately, they didn't come across any other mishap until they came out of the hallucinatory star field. They then arrived at another star region that was adjacent to the hallucinatory star field, River Shore Starfield. The Piyuan Villa was situated in the Shangyang city. It was less than 10,000 miles away from the borderline of the hallucinatory star field. Perhaps an ordinary person wouldn't be able to cover this distance in their entire lifetime. However, it wasn't very far for these experts. Yi Shiwen felt that the distorted appearance of the void had switched back to normal once they had come out of the hallucinatory star field. Finally, we've come out of that damned hallucinatory star field. Yi Shiwen let out a sigh of relief. Xiaoyu was standing beside him. He touched her small head. However, she only quietly looked at him and didn't say anything in response. A huge city was floating in the space at a distance. It was emitting colorful rays of light that had illuminated this section of the universe. Yan Hongyi told Yi Shiwen that this was the Shangyang City. The Shangyang City was undoubtedly much bigger than the Wind Dragon City. In fact, it was at least 10 times bigger than the Wind Dragon City. This city that was floating in space was established after many experts from various planets had ventured into this section of the universe. They had only established this city for their temporary stay. However, it had gradually developed into an enormous city. In fact, there weren't many cities in the true martial world that could be compared with such a big city. This endlessly spanning city looked pleasing to the eyes. One couldn't see its edge. The rays of light emanating from the barrier formations on the city's walls would flicker from time to time. Every section of the city's wall was covered with layers of matrix formation. This had been done in order to protect the city from the attacks of the star beasts. The faces of the Piyuan villas, people had a look of exhaustion when they saw that their home wasn't very far now. After all, they had been on the expedition in the hallucinatory star field for a very long time. Even the sage experts would get worn out in that strange starry region. So, nobody had dared to relax even a bit at that place. However, they now got some sense of relaxation when they saw that their home was right in front of them. Many experts were going through the required procedure for entering the city at the gates. The majority of them were legendary experts. The truth experts were very rare. However, the ratio of truth experts varied from world to world. This place was unlike various other worlds. So, it was difficult for the truth experts to survive in a starry region. In fact, it was even more difficult for them to survive in this starry region since it was very far from other inhabited worlds. Even the legendary experts could barely protect themselves here. The ship entered the Shangyang City. The experts stepped aside from the way. The soldiers above the city's walls didn't dare to stop the ship either. It was evident that the Piyuan villa didn't have a low status in the Shangyang City. Villa Lord Yan, it seems that your villa has a huge influence in the Shangyang City. Yi Shiwen let out a smile from the corner of his mouth as he looked at Yan Hongyi. Don't make fun of me, young brother Yi. I am only slightly famous in this city. Yan Hongyi replied. The ship arrived at an extremely big villa that was situated on the northern side of the city. Each house in the city was built like a huge building complex. The houses were spanning across the city. It was a magnificent sight. Villa Lord is back. The guards left to inform the people of the villa as soon as the ship arrived at the gate. Many old and young people gathered at the villa gate as a result. These people were the relatives of the experts that had gone out on the expedition. Yan Hongyi and the other experts stepped down from the ship. Then a beautiful girl hugged Yan Hongyi and shouted, "Daddy, you're back!" She appeared to be 17 or 18 years old. She had a small and beautiful face. Her skin was as fair as snow. Her big and round eyes were nimble and looked incomparably pretty. She was an extremely beautiful young girl. She was dressed up in fiery red dress which reflected her curvy figure. She also had a kind of indescribable agility in her. Yan Hongyi's face exposed a rare affectionate expression. He opened his mouth and said, "Of course, I am back. Where is your mother?" "Mother fell asleep," the young girl replied. Her wonderful eyes then turned towards Yi Shiwen. "You're Yi Shiwen, right? You're the one who helped my father in killing that fierce Starwolf King, aren't you?" These experts had already sent a message and had informed everyone about their safety. Therefore, it wasn't a surprise that she knew about Yi Shiwen as well. "Yunting, don't be impolite," Yan Hongyi said with a strict face. "Young brother Yi, I'm sorry. This is my daughter, Yan Yunting. She has been pampered since childhood, so she's a bit impolite. Why? I don't think he's that much older than me." Yan Yunting bit her lips and muttered resentfully, "Wow, this little sister is so pretty." Yan Yunting became surprised when she looked at Xiaoya, and her eyes started to shine. Yi Shiwen found her expression to be similar to that of those young girls he had seen in his previous life. They would have a similar reaction whenever they'd see a Barbie doll. Xiaoya's small and delicate face still carried a timid expression. It was also an expression of annoyance, but it looked cute nonetheless. Xiao, you didn't hide her face behind Yi Shiwen when Yan Yunting extended her palm towards her. She only grabbed his clothes. However, she seemed to be puzzled as she looked at Yan Yunting. Why does this elder sister look so surprised? Yan Yunting didn't feel embarrassed on seeing that Xiao Yu wasn't showing respect to her. Yunting, don't cause trouble. A serious look appeared on Yan Hongyi's face. He was afraid that his immature daughter might offend Yi Shiwen. After all, he and Yi Shiwen had gotten close on their way back. He had also found that Yi Shiwen didn't care much about ordinary matters. However, he cared a lot about that little girl who accompanied him. Gee, I was wondering why there's so much noise. I see, so the Villa Lord Yen has returned. Suddenly, a strange laughter sounded. Then, a group of men arrived walking through the street. They were headed by a young man who looked approximately 25 or 26 years old. He had pretty facial features. However, he had a gentle and reserved air about him. He was clad in a magnificent robe and looked like a playboy from his appearance. He was carrying a smile of mockery at the corner of his mouth. A group of experts followed him, and all of them were powerful sage experts who possessed a reserved aura. "It's you, Li Tian." An expression of disgust appeared on Yan Yunting's face when she saw this man arriving. Li Tian? Li Clan's people. This name immediately appeared in Yi Zaiwen's mind. He had heard this name many times from the mouths of the people of the Piyuan Villa while they were in the hallucinatory star field. Apparently, both these clans had been enemies since many generations. The complexions of the Piyuan Villa's people would always turn ugly whenever they'd mention anything about the Li Clan's people. And Yan Yunting's behavior had indirectly confirmed Yi Zaiwen's speculation. "Why have you come here?" Yan Hongyi's complexion also turned ugly as he asked with a serious countenance. How could this little nephew not have come after he heard that Villa Lord Yen had returned? Li Qingtian cupped his hands in obeisance and replied. However, there wasn't a trace of respect on his face. "I heard that Villa Lord Yen had been roaming in hallucinatory star field during those days. I wonder how well this trip of yours has turned out to be." "How dare you say that? You're a mean scum. We wouldn't have lost so many brothers if it wasn't for you." Yan Hongyi's complexion had turned very ugly. However, it was Huangwa who had retaliated this time. Oh yeah, you see, sometimes food can be eaten without hunger. But you must never talk nonsense. You yourself went to the hallucinatory star field. What does our Li clan have to do with that? Talking nonsense can get a person killed, you know." Li Cheng calculated secretly and said, "Honestly, this young nephew is very surprised. I hadn't expected that Villa Lord Yen would return safely." An expression of hate appeared on the faces of the Piyuan Villa's people. After all, they knew that the Li clan's people had caused those troubles for them. However, they couldn't do anything. "Villa Lord Yen, this young nephew has arrived here, and he wants to ask you something. What have you decided regarding the matter of marriage that I had mentioned last time?" Li Chengtian's intense gaze fell on Yan Yunting's curvy figure, and a sinister expression flickered in his eyes. "Get lost. I want to marry a person like you." Yan Yunting's small face turned a deep shade of red as she angrily replied. To be continued. Chapter 5:29. Get lost. I want to marry a person like you. Yan Yunting's face became flushed. She was gasping heavily in anger, and her bountiful chest was heaving. Her delicate face didn't have any deterrence force, but it still looked very charming. Yan Yin Ting, I'm talking to you nicely. Why must you always behave like this? I intend no harm to you. Li Chengtian shot a glance at Yan Yin Ting and said, You should leave. My daughter will never marry a person like you. Yan Hong stepped forward and coldly stated, Villa Lord Yan, you might want to give it a proper thought. Li Chengtian's complexion had turned cold. You won't want to put your Piyuan villa in harm's way because of your momentary anger, would you? Li Chengtian narrowed his eyes as he said. Then a trace of madness flickered in his eyes. Villa Lord Yan hasn't healed yet, as far as I know. So it would be better if you don't get too impulsive. Wasn't it your Li clan that used underhanded tricks to injure our Villa Lord? You get the hell out of here. Our young sister will never marry a scum like you, even if all of us have to die to protect her. Hu Ongwa coldly replied, Do you have a death wish? Li Chengtian's gaze turned gloomy and cold as he threatened. He then flew out, arrived in front of Hu Ongwa, and shot his palm. Bang! Li Chengtian's palm struck Hu Ongwa's chest. A tremendous force exploded and sent Hu Ongwa flying away. He collided with several people before his backwards momentum finally came to a halt. Li Chengtian was a shameless scoundrel. However, he was incredibly strong as well. In fact, his strength had reached the late stage of the sage realm. Moreover, he had only been cultivating for several hundred years. So, he could be called a top-notch expert among the younger elites. However, Hu Ongwa had entered the sage realm recently. So how could he be his match? Stop! Yan Hong moved into action. His big hand rose up and swept towards Li Chengtian to grab him. The space trembled and got distorted under the pressure of his big hand. One could well imagine the tremendous might carried by the attack of an angry expert of sage, small perfection realm. At this time, the 5 experts standing in the front row behind Li Chengtian attacked at once. Layer upon layer of divine beams fell from above and formed a big barrier of 5 elements, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, in order to protect Li Chengtian. Bang! Yan Hong's big hand grabbed this big barrier instead, and a dreadful rumbling sound swept out. Then a terrifying aura proliferated in the surroundings. Li Chengtian merely laughed as the dust settled. He looked towards Hu Ongwa. The man had already lost his consciousness. In fact, it wasn't clear whether Hu Ongwa was dead or alive. Didn't I tell you? Talking nonsense can get a person killed. Li Chengtian said. Then he turned towards Yan Hong and said, Villa Lord Yan, you're very impulsive. Li Chengtian's current ruthless appearance didn't divulge that he was the same person who had looked like an elegant young master a while ago. Yan Hong glared at him. However, he didn't rush towards him. Rather, he rushed towards those 5 individuals who stood behind him. However, he was surprised to see that each of these 5 individuals looked a bit similar to each other. All of them had a long and round waist and a burly figure. You're the 5 brothers of the Huang clan. Yan Hong looked at these 5 men with his ice-cold eyes. I've heard that each of you is at the Sage Peak realm. You've practiced the power technique of the 5 elements. So, you can lay down 5 elements, great barrier to contend against the experts of the Sage, small perfection level. Yi Shiwen had never heard about them. Therefore, he didn't give much importance to them. However, the countenances of the people of the Piyuan Villa had changed. After all, these 5 individuals were extremely famous in the Shangyang city. They had been famous for over 100 years because they could lay out the 5 elements, Great Barrier, and they could even use it to contend against the experts of the Sage, Small Perfection level. Sage, Small Perfection realm, and Sage Peak realm differed by far. There were many experts of Sage Peak realm in the Shangyang city. However, there were only a few experts of the Sage, Small Perfection realm. After all, every Sage, Small Perfection level expert needed to create a solid and deep foundation. And this was the disparity between the 2 realms. These 5 brothers were only at the Sage Peak realm, but they could still contend against the experts of the Sage Small Perfection realm. Therefore, their names had become widely famous in the region. These 5 brothers had always been independent. They didn't belong to any force of the city. However, nobody dared to provoke them even then. However, they had apparently joined the Li clan. This was something that no one could have predicted. I didn't expect that the 5 Huang brothers would join the Li clan. They have become the hired thugs of the Li clan. It's no wonder that Li Chengtian has dared to come here so arrogantly to provoke us. The backing of these brothers has given him so much confidence. Everyone was angrily looking at the 5 Huang brothers. It wasn't surprising that Li Chengtian had such a carefree expression on his face. The 5 brothers of the Huang clan had collectively laid out the 5 elements Great Barrier. They surely couldn't defeat a sage, small perfection level expert. However, it was also very difficult for a sage, small perfection level expert to defeat them. Yan Hong, he had sustained new injuries of late. Plus, his old injuries hadn't healed either. So, his strength had decreased considerably. Villa Lord Yen, you should think about it carefully. After all, it will be advantageous for both our clans if Yunting marries me. After all, the bond between our clans will strengthen because of our marriage alliance. And we won't have to be afraid of anyone in this Shangyang city after that. What do you say? Li Chengtian recklessly proposed. He was confident that Yan Hong, he couldn't do anything to him as long as he had these 5 brothers to back him up. This was why he had hastily arrived here right after Yan Hong Yi's return. I'm giving you 3 days to reconsider. I will return after 3 days, and I will either marry her or give you a declaration of war. I might as well inform Villa Lord in that my father has already reached the pinnacle of Sage, Small Perfection realm. Moreover, he is planning to undergo closed-door training after my wedding, and he will reach the Sage Great Perfection realm in about 3 to 5 years. So, he will be able to dominate the entire Shangyang city at that time. Even the city Lord won't be able to do anything to our clan. And your Piyuan villa will be destroyed if you reject my proposal. So, you must take the right decision since I genuinely don't wish to take that step. Li Chengtian threatened. However, nobody in the Piyuan villa cursed Li Chengtian for his arrogant and despotic behavior at this time. That's because they were still in a state of shock upon hearing that his father would soon make the breakthrough into Sage, Great Perfection realm. There was a big disparity between Sage Peak realm and Sage, Small Perfection realm. However, there was an even bigger disparity between Sage, Small Perfection realm and Sage, Great Perfection realm. A senior expert of the Sage Small Perfection realm could lay a strong foundation in the Shangyang city. However, a senior expert of the Sage Great Perfection realm could dominate the entire Shangyang city. The current city Lord of the Shangyang city was the only Sage Great Perfection realm expert in this city. A proud expression appeared on Li Chengtian's face when he saw that everyone was in shock. This is the time to change the rule in Shangyang city. This is my Li clan's time to rule. However, his gaze suddenly fell onto Xiaoya's body, and a fervently perverted look flickered in his eyes. This little girl is pretty good. How did I miss such a nice little thing earlier? I would have taken her home with me by now. Ha ha ha. Anyway, all these girls will be mine sooner or later. Li Chengtian's perversion became even worse. He licked his lips and said, "Dream on." Yan Yunting's beautiful eyes coldly glared at Li Chengtian. Suddenly, the rumor about Li Chengtian's interest in young girls echoed in her mind. There was no reason why she wouldn't feel disgusted by him. This is beyond your control. There is nothing that I can't obtain if I want to. Li Chengtian coldly snorted. He stretched his hand towards Xiaoya in order to grab her. The 5 brothers of Huang clan were standing behind him, and they were watching Yan Hong very nervously. They had gotten the information that Yan Hongyi had sustained serious injuries, and they knew that this had decreased his strength very considerably. However, he was still an expert of sage, small perfection realm, and they could contend against him only because of their powerful barrier technique. In other words, they didn't dare to underestimate a senior expert of the sage, small perfection realm. However, they soon realized that Yan Hongyi wasn't even thinking about attacking. Instead, a disdainful and gloated expression flashed in his eyes as he grinned. However, they couldn't understand why such an expression had appeared on his face. Idiot! Yan Hongyi secretly sneered in his heart. This Li Qingtian is courting death. However, Yan Yunting wasn't as confident as Yan Hongyi. Suddenly, a burst of energy emerged out of her body and soared upward. It was about to attack Li Qingtian. However, she then heard a bang sound. A big hand that was made up of energy stretched out from nowhere. It then pinched and crushed Li Qingtian's hand. Then, the energy hand transformed into a group of spirit energies and dispersed. Who are you? Li Qingtian's complexion changed as his sinister gaze fell upon Yi Shiwen. After all, he hadn't expected that this ordinary-looking young man would have effortlessly crushed and dispersed his attack. Yi Shiwen ignored Li Qingtian. He merely touched Xiao Ya's small head instead. He had seen that she had been scared by this incident, and her small face had turned deathly pale. So he softly said, "Don't worry, I'm here." "Yes." Xiaoya nodded. She didn't say anything else out of sensibility. Li Qingtian's complexion turned fierce after he saw that these two individuals had ignored him. He felt embarrassed as he furiously laughed. Ha 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 ha. Interesting. Very interesting. Nobody has dared to interfere in my business for so long. So, you're obviously an outsider. I had cut off the hands of the last idiot who had dared to interfere in my business. I don't want much for you. I will only cut your limbs and hang them on the city wall for everyone to see. And then I will see who else dares to interfere in my business. The 10 experts who were standing behind Li Qingtian also laughed nastily. They ran towards Yi Shiwen and surrounded him. All of them were sage experts. After all, Yi Shiwen was merely an expert of the intermediate stage of sage realm in their estimation. How could he face such an elite team? He would surely get crushed if he tried to face them. Li Qingtian took a glimpse at the expressions of those Piyuan Villa experts who had returned with Yan Hongyi. However, he found their expressions a bit strange. Also, why had Yan Hongyi not attacked yet? And why was it that he had an optimistic expression on his face? In fact, it seemed as if these people were looking forward to a good show. However, these thoughts disappeared from his mind as he ogled at Xiaoya with a lustful expression in his eyes. Anyway, Yi Shiwen was already a dead person in his opinion. Attack! It wasn't clear who had shouted among those experts. However, they rushed towards Yi Shiwen and issued their strongest attacks without any hesitation. They didn't seem to care that they might destroy this place. After all, it was Piyuan Villa's territory. You're an audacious bunch. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. His big hand stretched out, and that seemingly overwhelming barrage of attacks was instantly grabbed and extinguished by his big hand. These attacks didn't even get a chance to land. The complexions of those experts turned dull. After all, they hadn't thought that this would happen. However, they didn't get time to think much, since Yi Shiwen had already made his move. He trod forward, transformed into a streamer, and arrived in front of one of the experts. Then his big hand suddenly swept out. That expert couldn't avoid that hand. He could only watch it coming closer and closer. He could only stare blankly as that big hand slapped him on his face. Bang! That expert went out flying because of the tremendous impact. His teeth got smashed, his body rotated like a spinning top, and he went flying. Then he heavily slammed on the ground, and a huge crater opened therein. You were right about what you said. talking nonsense can really get a person killed. Yi Zaiwen's eyes turned extremely cold. To be continued. Chapter 530. You were right. Sometimes talking nonsense can really get a person killed. Yi Zaiwen's words seemed ruthless, as if they had come straight from hell. Xiao Ye had been with him for less than a year. However, this quiet and well-behaved young girl's cuteness had won him over. So, how could he tolerate the fact that someone had harbored ill thoughts about her? Li Changtian's sinister expression had frozen. Yi Zaiwen's movement was extremely quick as he appeared in front of another sage expert, like a golden flash of light. Then he lifted his foot and kicked that expert. The speed of his foot appeared to be slow. However, it was incomparably fast in reality. Therefore, that expert could only look helplessly as Yi Zaiwen's foot hit his chest. Bang! Crack, crack! The sound of breaking of bones was heard along with a muffled scream. That expert was sent flying upside down. He crashed into the ground and opened a huge crater before finally coming to a halt. His chest and sternum got crushed by Yi Zaiwen's kick. Moreover, he couldn't breathe either. So it was hard to say whether he would live or die. Bang! 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 Yi Zaiwen's golden figure flashed in front of those experts, one by one. They also didn't get any time to react and went out flying by his bombardments. They had been rendered breathless by the attacks. These people were basically the lackeys of Li Changtian. So Yi Shiwen felt that it wouldn't be a problem even if they died. Bang! Yi Shiwen arrived in front of the last expert and sent him flying too. Everyone was in a state of disbelief, except those people of the Piyuan villa who had returned with Yi Shiwen. Those people had no strength to fight back in front of Yi Zaiwen's attacks. However, they were sage experts in their own rights. Li Changtian's subordinates could only be considered as hired thugs. However, they were considered to be on the superior side in the Shangyang city. Li Changtian finally understood the reason behind the gloating expressions on the faces of those people of the Piyuan villa. They were laughing at my overconfidence. This young man possesses incredible strength. Li Changtian's countenance turned even more distorted, since he felt that everyone present there was ridiculing him. And all these things had happened because of the young man who was present before his eyes. "Kill him for me," he ordered the 5 Huang brothers who were present by his side. He didn't wish to believe that this young man couldn't be killed even after using the combined strength of the 5 Huang brothers. The 5 Huang brothers moved into action without any hesitation after they had heard Li Changtian's command. Each of their bodies separately radiated the light of 5 elements: metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. They unleashed terrifying auras as the 5 elements' great barrier swept towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. The 5 Huang brothers were experts of the Sage Peak realm. Even one of them was enough to wreak havoc, and they could even contend against an expert of the Sage, Small Perfection realm when together. This attack was different from the one they had used to stop Yan Hong a while ago. After all, they had attacked with their entire strength this time. The spirit energies of the entire Shangyang city had condensed at this place at a very high speed. Many experts of Shangyang city had also flown over to this place. However, they were witnessing this fight from afar because they couldn't dare to come near. After all, the Piyuan villa was a big force in Shangyang city since it was home to many experts. Aren't they the 5 Huang brothers? I've heard that they've joined the Li clan. But why are they fighting here at Piyuan villa? Li clan has gone off the leash. Li clan's clan lord is about to make the breakthrough into the Sage Great Perfection realm. He will dominate the entire Shangyang city after that. Piyuan villa's Yan Hong has a very old enmity with Li clan. It is said that the wife of the villa lord Yan Hong had been courted by Li clan's clan lord as well. However, villa lord Yan married her in the end. In fact, this bitter enmity between these clans is more than 100 years old. The 5 elements' great barrier shook the void as it arrived in an overwhelming manner. It surged forward and issued vibrations all over. The 5 Huang brothers had attacked with their entire strength and had unleashed their endless might in sync. Yi Zaiwen's complexion had also turned a bit solemn. After all, he wasn't dealing with ordinary sage experts this time. Faint, golden rays of light had begun to flicker on his body. The divinities were looming. Suddenly, a dreadful murderous aura swept out from his body and soared up. Consequently, cracks appeared in the void. Yi Shiwen didn't speak anything while facing the 5 elements' great barrier. He merely stretched out his big hand. It transformed into a star and swept out. Bang! The star ferociously collided with the matrix formation of the 5 elements. The clash issued incomparably ferocious shock waves, and they instantly ripped apart the void. Even the fortified space of the city couldn't resist the impact that was produced by this collision. Everyone's complexion had turned pale in amazement. The 5 Huang brothers were legendary. But who was this young man? No one could believe their eyes when they saw that he hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position while fighting the 5 brothers. The 5 brothers were also somewhat stunned. They had secretly locked most of their energy on Yan Hong Yi's body. After all, they were afraid that Yan Hong Yi might launch a sudden attack. They could indeed contend against an expert of the sage, small perfection realm. However, that was only possible when all 5 brothers fought together. Also, they could only contend against an expert of the sage, small perfection realm, but they couldn't defeat him. Therefore, they had to be careful at all times. However, they hadn't expected that Yan Hong Yi would never attack, and that this young man who they didn't care about would be able to stop their attack single-handedly. They certainly hadn't used their full strength yet. Still, an ordinary person couldn't stop the 5 elements' great barrier. After all, it had the power to blast away an average expert of the Sage Peak realm. Yi Shiwen landed on the ground. His black hair was fluttering in the wind. His eyes looked profound, and it seemed as if a universe had taken birth inside them. His fighting intention soared, and it seemed that he possessed a monstrous aura. Everyone had thought that he wouldn't be able to stop the attack of the 5 Huang brothers. However, everyone had been proven wrong. Young man, you're pretty good, but this is it for you. The eldest among those 5 brothers shouted. Simultaneously, his imposing aura surged sharply. It had become even more dreadful than before. The minds of these 5 brothers were interlinked. Therefore, they thought of the same thing. They knew that they had to attack this man with all of their strength this time around. In fact, they had stopped thinking about Yan Hong Yi for the time being. Die! Yi Shiwen bellowed. He trod forward at an abnormally quick pace. Simultaneously, the golden rays of light emanating from his body became even more intense. He looked like a golden god as he rushed forward to face his enemy's attack. Yi Shiwen didn't use any special move. Only his fist swept out. Yet it carried tremendous power. He forged ahead, relying only on the toughness of his body, and took on the 5 Huang brothers. His monstrous aura could have scared a person to death. The aura spread out in all directions. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen hadn't used any fancy moves. He had only shot his fists. The 5 Huang brothers had thought that Yi Shiwen either had a death wish or he had gone crazy. After all, that was the only possible explanation for fighting them unarmed. However, they soon realized how mistaken they were. There was nothing stylish about Yi Zaiwen's fist attacks. However, every fist had shaken their 5 elements' great barrier. Li Changtian's countenance had also turned exceptionally stiff on the other side. After all, he hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would be so insanely powerful. In fact, he had initially thought that the 5 Huang brothers would take care of him with ease. However, Yi Shiwen had left them to tremble. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's fist pounded on the 5 elements' great barrier once again. Bang! The barrier shattered into pieces. Poof! 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 It seemed as if the 5 brothers had been accidentally struck by lightning. They spouted blood from their mouths as their bodies were sent out flying. Bang! They crashed into the ground, and a huge crater was formed. Li Chengtian became scared when he saw that Yi Shiwen was coming towards him step by step. Even his arms had begun to shake slightly. It wasn't that he had never seen a powerful expert. In fact, he had seen the strongest experts in Shanyang City. However, he hadn't thought that this ordinary-looking young man could wipe out the 5 Huang brothers within such a short span of time. After all, he had enormous faith in them. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come to the Piyuan villa so rashly. "What do you want to do?" Li Qingtian swallowed his saliva. He had become very nervous. "Didn't you do what you wanted to do just now? So, now I will do what I want to do." Yi Shiwen replied insipidly. His expression looked cold, as if he was talking to a dead person. Li Chengtian had killed many people in his life. However, most of them were young and weak people. In fact, he would have collapsed very easily if he had encountered people who were far stronger than him. However, Yi Shiwen was different. Many of the people whom he had killed were more tyrannical than him. Of course, he had reached up to here after fighting and defeating all those powerful enemies. That's why he had a seemingly invincible aura, and Li Qingtian didn't. "Don't you dare trying something. My father is the clan lord of the Li clan. The Li clan won't let you off easily if you so much as even touched me." Li Chengtian swallowed his saliva as he tried hard to maintain a stern look in order to intimidate Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked at him and shook his head as a look of disappointment appeared in his eyes. Li Chengtian was also a sage expert like those 5 Huang brothers. However, his aura wasn't even close to their imposing auras. In fact, it was simply pathetic. He was merely a weakling who depended on powerful connections and bullied the weak. And it was a waste to spend resources on trash like him. Li Chengtian noticed Yi Zaiwen's disdain for him by looking at his facial expressions. Li Cheng's face became stiff. Then, a sly look appeared on his face. "Go to hell!" A sage-level-long sword suddenly appeared in Li Chengtian's hand, and he hacked it at Yi Shiwen without delay. However, he realized that his sage sword had only slashed Yi Zaiwen's afterimage. Suddenly, Yi Shiwen appeared in front of Li Chengtian and snatched the sage sword from his hand at a lightning speed. After that, he fiercely slapped Li Chengtian on his face. Bang! Li Chengtian's body rotated rapidly like a spinning top and went backwards at a very fast speed. His forehead almost got smashed and his teeth got shattered. Bang! Li Chengtian's body ferociously crashed into the ground, and a huge crater was formed. He lost consciousness soon after. To be continued. Chapter 531. A plus A. Chapter 531. Can't we ask Yi Shiwen for help? Li Chengtian had gone out flying. He had crashed into the ground, and a huge crater had been formed as a result. He had also lost consciousness because of this impact. In fact, it was hard to say whether he would survive or not. Yi Zaiwen's incredible strength and ruthlessness had shocked and terrified everyone. They secretly compared his strength with their own. His attack had looked gentle, and they could see that Li Chengtian hadn't died. However, Li Chengtian had definitely sustained some serious injuries. "Isn't he afraid of the Li clan's retaliation?" someone whispered. "He has defeated the 5 Huang brothers. It shows that he can challenge the experts of the sage, small perfection realm with ease. So he may not face much trouble, even if the Li clan flies into a rage." Who is this man? He certainly doesn't belong to the Piyuan villa. Otherwise, he would have become famous in the entire Shanyang city by now. Yan Hong, he was also in a state of shock after having witnessed Yi Zaiwen's fierceness. It wasn't like Yan Hong, he hadn't killed many people himself. However, the way in which Yi Shiwen had casually beaten them up had left him extremely scared. That look of indifference in Yi Zaiwen's eyes had shaken him in particular. Such a resolute disposition is hard to imagine. He couldn't help but sigh as he thought of this. He had wanted to recruit Yi Shiwen. In fact, he was even willing to step down from the position of the villa lord of the Piyuan villa for Yi Shiwen. However, it suddenly seemed that his desire to recruit Yi Shiwen couldn't be fulfilled. It's impossible to contain this extraordinary young man in such a small place. Suddenly, Yan Hongyi realized that Yi Shiwen had hurt Li Qingtian very badly. Li Qingtian was in a miserable state as a result. In fact, he was lingering between life and death. This worried Yan Hongyi so much that he started to have a headache. He clearly knew that Li Clan's clan lord loved his son very much. After all, he had even arranged goons like the 5 Huang brothers to guard his son. So, how could he leave the matter after he had come to know that his son had been beaten up this badly? Anyway, everything had already happened. So, there was nothing he could achieve by thinking too much about it now. Also, it didn't matter whether Li Qingtian survived or not. After all, his condition would make no difference anymore. The Li clan wouldn't spare Piyuan Villa once they had moved into action. Yan Hongyi shot a glance at Yi Shiwen and pondered over something. We may get over this calamity if this man stays here with us. Yi Shiwen looked at Li Qingtian. He had attacked without holding back. He hadn't killed Li Qingtian. However, he had left him half dead. The impact had even shaken Li Qingtian's mind. Consequently, he would only be a fool from now onwards. Villa Lord Yan, I have increased your troubles by doing this. Yi Shiwen turned around towards Yan Hongyi and said, It doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. The Li clan has long been eyeing our Piyuan villa. We would have been killed by those star beasts back in the hallucinatory star field if young brother Yi hadn't helped. So I think we owe you one. Yan Hongyi replied very cordially. He would never harbor ill will towards Yi Shiwen, even if he had to face Li clan's fury. Nobody had imagined that Li Qingtian would arrive in search of trouble at this time. However, he hadn't been able to cause any trouble for them. Instead, he himself had gotten into trouble and had been left crippled in the end. This news had spread throughout the Shangyang city overnight. Many people had witnessed the fight, so it was impossible for the Piyuan villa to stop this news from spreading. And it had caused a sensation in the entire city in no time. Did you hear? Li Qingtian has been crippled by someone. Li Qingtian. Isn't he the eldest son of Li clan's lord? Who can dare to harm him? Do they have a death wish? Ha ha ha. God is watching. Li Qingtian had it coming. He was always bossing around people by using the influence of Li clan. But he messed with the wrong guy this time and got wrecked for it. Damn. Rumors had spread in abundance overnight. Many other forces had also added fuel to the fire. They wanted to see an intense collision between the two giants, Li clan and Piyuan villa. They hoped that the clash would be earth-shattering. After all, nothing could be as good as this. Different kinds of rumors had begun to prevail. Some people were also saying that Yan Hongyi had fought and defeated the 5 Huang brothers, and he had then brutally beaten up and crippled Li Qingtian. After all, there was no other logical explanation for what had happened to Li Qingtian and the 5 Huang brothers. People couldn't believe that some young man had defeated the 5 Huang brothers. Consequently, the information about Yi Shiwen nearly got concealed under these rumors. The Li clan eventually made a move amidst these rumors and anticipations. A declaration of war was sent to the Piyuan villa as a result. The Li clan's clan lord would personally arrive after 3 days, and he would ask for an explanation regarding what had happened to his son. Moreover, he had challenged the villa Lord Yan to a mortal combat, and only one of them would survive it. The entire city was already bustling with noise and excitement when this news added fuel to the fire. However, everyone suddenly became eager to watch this battle now. The collision between these two big forces would lead to the establishment of one huge force in the Shangyang city. The other would obviously be eliminated. Moreover, a senior expert of the sage, small, complete realm, would be overseeing the battle. This was set from the beginning that one individual would certainly die in this mortal combat. So, one amongst these two forces was bound to collapse after this death match. Almost everyone was optimistic about the Li clan in this situation. After all, the Li clan's clan lord had already reached the pinnacle of the sage, small perfection realm, and he was soon going to enter the sage, great perfection realm. He would dominate the entire Xiangyang city once that had happened. Moreover, the news about Yan Hongyi's injuries had also started to do rounds. The Li clan's clan lord was a bit stronger than Yan Hongyi. Moreover, Yan Hongyi's injuries hadn't healed yet. Wasn't it already obvious who would win and who would lose? The news that two big forces were on the verge of collision had stirred up a storm in Xiangyang City. Yan Hongyi was reading the declaration of war that he had received from Li clan's clan lord. He was inside his study room in the Piyuan villa at this time. He sighed as he read the declaration. His daughter, Yan Yunting, was beside him. It seemed as if she had matured all of a sudden. The immature temperament of a little girl had vanished from her persona. She understood that Piyuan villa was currently passing through its most dangerous time to date. The entire Piyuan villa was solely relying upon Yan Hongyi. In fact, it might collapse in a flash if they lost the support of a senior sage, small, complete realm expert like Yan Hongyi. There were several other experts of the Sage Peak realm in the villa. However, there was a huge gap between the Sage Peak realm and the Sage, small perfection realm. The gap was like the natural moat around the city. It kept most of the experts from advancing. And those sage experts would remain stuck at the checkpoint between the Sage Peak realm and the Sage, small perfection realm throughout their lives. Therefore, it could be assumed that the Piyuan villa's decline would only be a matter of time if Yan Hongyi died. "Daddy, you mustn't go. Li Fei Bai would stop at nothing. He's about to enter the Sage, great perfection realm. So, he will certainly resort to extreme methods to kill you." Yan Yunting bit her red lips and said, "I know, but there is no other way. The courage of the Piyuan villas. People will collapse if I don't go." Yan Hongyi sighed as he replied, "Such is always the condition of a force that solely depends on one person. The entire force collapses in time if that person dies. But Daddy, you could have given all you've got if you weren't injured. However, you are badly injured. How can you be a match for Li Fei Bai in this condition? Li Fei Bai wants to use this opportunity to get rid of you. That's why he has proposed a mortal combat. Daddy, you should wait until you've recovered from your injuries. You can face him after that." Yan Yunting said, "Silly girl, my injuries won't heal easily. In fact, they will take many years to fully heal. I hope that they will heal in one fell swoop if I make the breakthrough into the Sage, great perfection realm. Besides, do you think Li Fei Bai is so honorable that he will wait for my injuries to heal?" Yan Hongyi sneered. He was very familiar with his old rival, Li Fei Bai. They had grown to understand each other well during this 100 years old enmity. "I reckon he won't even wait for 3 days if I don't accept this declaration of war. In fact, he might even launch a surprise attack on Piyuan Villa tonight itself. Isn't he afraid of being punished by the city lord?" Yan Yunting asked, startled. Her pair of wonderful eyes opened wide in wonder. "City lord? Can he do anything after everything were to have taken place? Once something happens, it cannot be changed. So, why would he provoke the Li clan for us?" Yan Hongyi replied in a straightforward manner. However, he knew that people could be very fickle when it comes to their own survival. Nobody knew better about the inconstancies of human relationships than him. That was why the thought of recruiting Yi Shiwen had previously arisen in his mind. After all, Piyuan Villa's situation would have changed significantly if he had recruited Yi Shiwen. "I've been in conflict with Li Fei Bai since several 100 years. I know him well. He must have made a strategy to kill me since he has chosen to send a declaration of war so confidently," Yan Hongyi sighed and said. "However, I don't have any way out this time. Our several hundred years old resentment must get settled this time. Moreover, I must go and fight for the sake of the Piyuan villa. You must take your mother out of Shangyang City, along with the other people of the Piyuan villa, and you must never come back. Daddy! Yan Yunting nearly jumped up. How can this be? You must be obedient. Li Fei Bai is very merciless by nature. So, he wants spare Piyuan villa after he has killed me. Therefore, you must take everyone out of here when everyone's attention is drawn to our fight. Yan Hongyi said, You will have to take care of your mother in the future. Fortunately, I think that you've also grown up now. Yan Yunting looked at Yan Hongyi. Her eyes had turned red from the crying. She softly said, Daddy, no. I will marry Li Qingtian. No. Yan Hongyi immediately replied, Li Qingtian has been notorious since 100 years. Who doesn't know about his evil acts? You will undoubtedly tread dangerous grounds if you marry him. Moreover, he's nothing more than an idiot now. How can I helplessly see you throwing away your life? Anyway, Li Fei Bai hasn't been targeting me for 1 or 2 days now. Our enmity is very old. He won't spare our villa even if you marry Li Qingtian. He won't give up until he has either destroyed or annexed our villa. Yan Hongyi shook his head. He had rejected Yan Yunting's idea without even giving it any thought. Daddy, can't we ask others for help? Isn't that Yi Shiwen very powerful? He has even defeated a demon beast of the sage, small perfection realm. Things can change if he gets involved. Yan Yunting bit her lips and said, To be continued. Chapter 532. A+A. Chapter 532. Fight begins. Young brother Yi is obviously very strong. Perhaps even an expert of sage small perfection realm is no match for him. However, Li Fei Bai has reached the pinnacle of sage small perfection realm. He's about to enter the sage great perfection realm. So, young brother, you may not want to face him. Moreover, he has already helped us once. How can I shamelessly ask him to fight for us again? Yan Hongyi shook his head and said, Moreover, he was afraid that he would land into a big trouble if he made Yi Shiwen angry. Forget it. This matter is already decided. You will take your mother and the others out of here after 3 days. I must take care of this matter on my own. The night gradually turned darker. Yi Shiwen was blasting his fists in the air inside a small courtyard. He hadn't even used a trace of his real energy. However, the air would still get disintegrated wherever his fists would go. The sound of explosion could be heard from time to time. However, the sound from most of the explosions had been contained by an energy field that didn't allow any sound to proliferate. Sweat dripped from Yi Ziwen's forehead as he panted unceasingly. These several years of expeditions had put him in many dangerous situations. There was hardly any time when he could relax and didn't need to be vigilant. So he had decided to work on his fist technique now that he had gotten the time to relax. He had been practicing Big Bang Stardust Fist for a long time now. However, his comprehension of this fist technique could only be called normal when compared to his blade technique or his sword technique. He knew around 100 forms of his fist technique. However, there was still a big disparity in comparison to those people who had been practicing their fist technique for many years. He had been reducing the gap between lifting heavy weight as if it's light and lifting light weight as if it's heavy. However, he wasn't some genius who would understand it all at a glance. The comprehension of these foundations was the most basic step on his cultivation journey. The stronger the foundation, the faster his cultivation speed would be in the future. He hadn't been able to enter the realm of lifting light weight as if it's heavy even after so many years. However, he believed that his fighting strength would increase enormously once he had entered this realm. This tremendous improvement wouldn't take place because of his physical strength or because of practicing some great secret technique. Rather, it would happen because of the promotion off the foundation of his cultivation. Consequently, his powers would also become more efficient. Xiao Yu was looking at Yi Shiwen, practicing the fist technique. She was calmly looking at him with a rare smile on her face. Suddenly, a sound of rushing footsteps came from the outside. Xiao Yi slowly walked out to check. However, she collided with Yan Yunting as she rushed in. I'm sorry. Are you hurt? Yan Yunting became anxious when she realized that she had collided with Xiaoya. After all, she liked this quiet little girl very much. Little sister, is your elder brother here? Yan Yunting asked. She liked Xiaoya very much. However, she wasn't in a mood to think about this issue at the moment. Xiaoya quietly nodded. Her small and delicate face carried a faint smile. So, it seemed that she was in a good mood. Yi Shiwen. Yan Yunting entered the courtyard. Then, she saw Yi Shiwen sitting on the branch of a big tree inside the courtyard. The starlight was falling obliquely on his body and was illuminating it. Excuse me. Yan Yunting stopped as she realized that her actions were discourteous. What's the matter? Yi Shiwen jumped down from the branch of the tree. Then he looked at Yan Yunting and asked, Young brother Yi, please save our Pun villa. Yan Yunting suddenly knelt down. Her eyes filled with tears as she said this. Get up first. Yi Zaiwen's eyes moved swiftly as he extended his hand. He didn't allow her to continue kneeling. His real elemental energy held Yan Yunting and made her stand up. First tell me what has happened. I know my request can be very troublesome for you. However, I plead you to save our Pun villa. Save my daddy. Yan Yunting replied. Villa Lord Yan? What happened to him? Yi Shiwen asked. Is it about Li Clan's declaration of war? Yi Shiwen thought for a moment and understood why Yan Yunting had arrived in such a rush. It obviously wasn't Yan Hong Yi's idea. After all, he would have arrived here personally if he wanted to talk. So, this must be her idea. Moreover, such a fast action also matched her carefree personality. Yes, Li Fei Beis hates my daddy. So, he will resort to extreme methods if this mortal combat were to take place. He won't spare my daddy. Therefore, I request you to please save my daddy. Yan Yunting's eyes were filled with tears as she said. She suddenly felt how foolish she had been when she hadn't seen her daddy's suffering in the past. I would have helped even if you hadn't asked when it comes to the Li clan's declaration of war. After all, I'm also involved in this matter. Yi Shiwen nodded and replied. It was true that the two clans had already harbored grudges against each other. However, it was Yi Ziven who had ignited this conflict. Otherwise, this conflict could very well have been delayed for several years. Thank you very much. Yan Yunting bowed repeatedly to express her gratitude. Her eyes were filled with tears. I will do whatever you want as long as you save our villa and my daddy's life. Hey, don't treat me like someone who would fall as low as to take advantage of your hardship, okay? Yi Shiwen helplessly looked at Yan Yunting. After all, taking advantage of someone's hardship was beneath his dignity. Yan Yunting looked at Yi Shiwen with a somewhat embarrassed expression on her face. However, she also felt a bit relieved. After all, she had made up her mind to sacrifice herself for saving her daddy and the Pun villa. However, she also became a bit annoyed once she felt relieved. After all, she was famous for her beauty in the entire Shangyang city. How could she have such a weak S** X appeal? Clarifying one's intentions was understandable, but he didn't have to reject her offer so blatantly and hurriedly. Yan Yunting's mind had previously been in chaos. However, she had suddenly felt stress-free once she had received the assurance that Yi Shiwen would help them. But it wasn't known where her hyperactive little mind had flown off to all of a sudden. Yi Shiwen didn't know that Yan Yunting was presently thinking about stuff like that. Otherwise, perhaps he would have felt even more helpless. Yan Yunting's behavior had gone beyond his imagination tonight. He had felt that she was a pampered little princess when he had seen her for the first time. However, she seemed a lot more mature right now. Apparently, people need to experience some things in life in order to grow up. Maturity has nothing to do with strength or age. For example, Li Qingtian was a spoiled brat of a rich clan in Yi Zaiwen's opinion, and there wouldn't have been any significant difference in his personality, even if he had possessed formidable strength. Listen, Villa Lord Yen will think that I am bullying you if he sees you in this state. Yi Shiwen looked at Yan Yunting helplessly and said, You don't look old from your appearance. In fact, you look like a teenager. You may even be younger than me. So, why do you always come across as an old man? Yan Yunting smiled through her tears as she said, I've got a lot of experience. Yi Shiwen laughed. He was completely different from the pampered Yan Yunting, whose life had been smooth so far. He had obtained so much experience by cultivating for most of his life. How he could be like her? How deep is the enmity between your daddy and Li Clan's clan lord? Yi Shiwen curiously asked. The Piyuan villas, people had been talking about the Li clan since the time he had met them. So it was evident that the two sides didn't have a small grudge. My daddy and Li Fei Bai courted my mother when they were young. Eventually, my mother chose daddy since he had a humble background. However, daddy and Li Fei Bai have been fighting for several hundred years because of this matter. Li Fei Bai has unceasingly tried to destroy our Piyuan villa. They've fought with each other many times. The old injuries on daddy's body are also because of Li Fei Bai's plot. Yan Yunting slowly narrated the entire story. It was very common for two people to be jealous of each other because of a love affair when they were young. However, it was rare for such a jealousy to continue for several hundred years. Therefore, it was clear that Li Fei Bai's desire for revenge was very strong. Li Fei Bai and Daddy fought secretly at first. So, it was difficult to determine the winner and loser. However, Daddy has sustained serious injuries this time around, and Li Fei Bai has advanced greatly. So, he must be assured of his win. And that's why he has sent this declaration of war. It's because this is the perfect opportunity for him to kill Daddy. Yan Yunting said, This is going to be difficult. Yi Shiwen secretly thought. It was widely known that Li Fei Bai was about to enter the sage, great perfection realm. This obviously meant that he was at the pinnacle of sage, small perfection realm. He must be stronger than that fierce Starwolf king. However, he was involved in this matter. So he couldn't back down no matter what. 3 days' time had passed in a flash. It had disappeared within the blink of an eye. No news came out about Li Clan or Piyuan Villa in these 3 days. However, that didn't mean that the city was in peace. On the contrary, the entire Shangyang city was seething with excitement because of Li Clan's declaration of war. The hatred and desire for revenge between Li Clan and Piyuan Villa had lasted for several hundred years. So, many people knew that it was the time to end this hatred and desire for revenge. Moreover, it was inevitable that only one party would survive in the end. The enmity of several centuries would come to an end when the two big forces would try to overthrow the other this time. Yan Hongyi, come out to die! A loud shout came from the space outside the city on the morning of the 3rd day. The rumbling sound shook the entire Shangyang city. In fact, it seemed that it would disintegrate the entire city. A figure was issuing dreadful power in the space. He looked like an ominous god who was demonstrating his monstrous might in space. Everyone knew that the mortal combat was about to begin. This exceptional fight would decide the rise or fall of two clans. The entire starfield was shaking. This fight had to take place in the space. After all, it was a confrontation between two senior experts of Sage, small perfection realm. Therefore, the entire Shangyang city could get destroyed if either of them forgot to take precaution. Consequently, such a stunning fight could only take place in the space. After all, only the space could withstand such a fight without thoroughly collapsing. That ice-cold figure exuded a chilling and murderous aura. Many people were left trembling and didn't dare to come close. However, an increasing number of people had still gathered since they wanted to see this exceptional battle. Bang! An imposing aura exploded from the Shanyang city and soared up. It was located far away from Li Fei Bei's stunning aura. A figure came out of the city and rushed into the space. To be continued. Chapter 533. A plus A. Chapter 533. Things take a new turn. The entire Piyuan villa had turned quiet in the morning. There was an unusual silence everywhere. It seemed as if everyone had gone to see the duel between Yan Hongyi and Li Feibai. Numerous whistling sounds were coming from a distant place. Numerous people were heading towards the Piyuan villa on their flying lights. Such a commotion alarmed many experts along the way. After all, there were no ordinary civilians in this city. Everyone in this city was a martial arts expert. Therefore, it was hard to say how superior their perception skills were when compared to that of ordinary people. The divine senses swept from all around and caught on this huge group. Li Clan? They are Li Clan's people. What are they doing here? Oh God, they are the famous experts of Li Clan. Aren't those 8 men in the front the Li Clan's 8 tigers? I've heard that each of them is an expert of the Sage Peak realm. They enjoy a huge reputation in the Li Clan. Each of them can rule over a region. They rarely appear together. However, they've turned out in full strength now. What is Li Clan planning to do? Is that old man in the front Li Clan's hidden great elder? Look at his aura. Has he already broken into the sage, small perfection realm? There was an old man leading the group of experts of Li Clan. He was dressed up in a green robe. His countenance looked ice-old and a bit pompous. His unstable aura was occasionally leaking from his body. He was a dreaded expert of the sage, small perfection realm. He had entered the sage, small perfection realm very recently, so his aura was a bit unstable. Nonetheless, he was in sage, small perfection realm, and Sage Peak realm couldn't hold a candle to it. He's really at the sage, small perfection realm. Some weak experts in the city trembled under the coercion of this old great elder. They couldn't even prevent their bodies from shivering. Look at the direction they are headed towards. Is it Piyuan Villa? Yan Hongyi and Li Feibai are fighting outside the city, and a group of experts of Li Clan has turned out in full strength. It's obvious that they want to exterminate the Piyuan Villa. This is a very good strategy. It's game over for Piyuan Villa this time. The experts of Li Clan were moving very quickly. They were advancing aggressively and didn't seem to care about concealing themselves. In fact, it seemed that they wanted everyone to see them. Some insightful people had already understood what was going on. After all, Li Clan's actions had explained everything very simply. Li Clan wanted to establish their prestige. They wanted everyone to see how a colossal force of the Shanyang city, like the Piyuan Villa, had to collapse in front of them. The Shanyang city was very big. However, those experts of the Li Clan had crossed it within a short span of time upon their flying lights. The barrier formation that was protecting the Piyuan Villa had gotten activated while facing the group of experts from the Li Clan. Li Clan's great elder stepped forward. His imposing aura surged up. Then it transformed into a gigantic, glowing red light and soared up. He looked like an ominous devil at this moment. His blazing gaze could pierce the 9 heavens. Humph! The Li Clan's great elder coldly snorted. Then he suddenly stomped his foot and issued a wave of bright red light. The light carried tremendous power as it swept down like a tide towards the barrier. The red light collided with the matrix formation that was protecting the villa. Endless divine beam spattered in all directions for a moment. The spirit energies in the surroundings got churned and thrown in all directions. The space also collapsed as this happened. Bang! The entire matrix formation that was protecting the villa broke down within a split second. After all, it couldn't resist this attack from such a close distance. The dreadful strength of an expert of sage small perfection realm had manifested itself. Who has dared to cause a disturbance in our Piyuan villa? Suddenly, a delicate shout came from inside the villa. It then transformed into sound arrows and shot towards the Li clan's great elder. This pathetic little trick won't work. The Li clan's great elder took a step. Countless spirit energies instantly gathered under his feet and condensed into a thick shield before him. Whoosh! Whoosh! Those sound arrows tore through the atmosphere and crashed into that spirit energy shield, and metal clanging sounds were issued as a result. It seemed as if a giant bell had rung through the atmosphere. In fact, a terrible storm had been set off because of this. Several figures flew out of the Piyuan villa at this time. They were led by Yen Yunting. She seemed to have lost her mischievous vibe. On the contrary, she looked reliable and experienced. Why have you Li people come here? An expert of the Sage Peak realm attacked from inside the Piyuan villa at this time. A long sword cut open the space as he attacked, and took the form of a hanging galaxy. The boundless galaxy then suddenly swept down. This was an attack from an experienced Sage Peak realm expert of Piyuan villa. A mantis trying to stop a chariot, eh? Don't overestimate your capabilities. Li clan's great elder sneered. His skinny figure appeared incomparably large as he stood there motionless. That hanging galaxy arrived in front of the Li clan's great elder within the blink of an eye, and he finally moved. However, he then stretched out his big hand, and it covered everything in an overwhelming manner as it swept out. In fact, it seemed as if boundless clouds had fallen down. The scene looked like an apocalyptic sight. The galaxy and the clouds collided and issued a dreadful storm. The vast atmosphere got shattered and dispersed in all directions. Ah! A scream was heard at the same time. That expert of Sage Peak realm screamed, and was sent flying away by the explosion. He collided with several buildings before he came to a halt, and most of his body had begun to collapse as a result. How audacious! Your Li clan has gone too far. A loud shout came from inside the villa as a spear was shot out. It slashed out unrestrained divine beams that took the form of a giant dragon. It was a terrifying sight. This long spear was carrying incomparably powerful energy. It locked on Li clan's great elder and streaked across the atmosphere with an irresistible force. The Li clan's great elder didn't dare to neglect this attack. In fact, he got a bit scared this time. It could even be said that the terrifying power from this spear had left him to tremble. Moreover, he didn't have enough time to react this time. That spear reached near him in a flash. He had laid out several defenses in front of him. However, these defenses got smashed to pieces under the spear attack. However, his defenses gave him some time to react. So his figure turned around and flew away. But that spear had still opened a large wound on his body, and blood gushed out from that wound as an overbearing energy invaded his body. Who? The great elder's vision swept across the Piyuan villa's buildings. Old man, I'm surprised that you are still alive. Your Li clan is vicious and merciless. You couldn't even wait for a little while. A figure emerged from inside the Piyuan villa along with these cold words. It was none other than the villa lord of Piyuan villa, Yan Hong Yi. How can Yan Hong Yi be here? Many experts who were watching the scene from afar were stunned. Yan Hong Yi is here. So who is dueling with Li Fei by outside the city? This question appeared in many people's minds. They got very excited since things had taken a new turn. Many people had run from the city because of the impending duel between Yan Hong Yi and Li Fei Bai. And the Li clan had taken advantage of this situation. They had launched an attack on the Piyuan villa under the leadership of that great elder who had recently entered the Sage Small Perfection realm. They wanted to wipe out Piyuan villa so that they didn't have to worry about it in the future. However, They couldn't have imagined that Yan Hongyi would still be inside the Piyuan villa. After all, he was supposed to have gone for the duel with Li Fei Bai. The situation had become very confusing. Many people had been certain of Li Clan's victory before the event had started. However, they weren't entirely sure now. Yan Hongyi, is it really you? Li Clan's great elder asked with a look of astonishment on his face. Yan Hongyi was supposed to have gone for the duel. However, he is here. So, who has gone there? Is it a trap? Li Clan's great elder started to think of all kinds of conspiracies. His countenance had turned even more complicated as he looked at Yan Hongyi, the youth who had grown up under the pressure of Li Clan and had eventually become the role model for people who came from a humble background. Yan Hongyi's countenance had turned cold. He was extremely glad that he hadn't taken the wrong step. He had certainly believed that Li Clan would attack Piyuan Villa, but only after Li Fei Bai had killed him. So he had felt that they would have the time to rescue everyone. However, he hadn't thought that the Li Clan's attack on Piyuan Villa would take place parallel to his mortal combat with Li Fei Bai. It seemed that the Li Clan didn't wish to give Piyuan Villa any chance of survival. Yan Hongyi felt cold in his heart as he thought of this. After all, he would have dragged the Piyuan Villa's people to death along with him. However, he fortunately didn't take that step. How can you be here? It's impossible. Here? It's impossible. Li Clan's great elder shouted in disbelief. Nothing is impossible. But it's time to settle our centuries-old score. Yan Hongyi's eyes had turned ice-cold. In the extraterritorial battlefield on the other side, Li Fei Bai was alone and was showing off his exceptional fighting strength in the space. A formidable coercion radiated from him in all directions. In fact, even the experts who had wanted a better view hadn't dared to come close. Li Fei Bai's middle-aged handsome face revealed an ice-cold and ruthless expression. He had anticipated Yan Hongyi to appear before his eyes. However, Yan Hongyi hadn't come. Instead, a green-clothed young man had appeared before him. His figure was slim, and his aura was surging. Moreover, his aura gave off a sense of arrogance, as if he looked down on the world. Yi Shiwen was extremely quick. He had suddenly appeared in front of Li Fei Bai by treading on his flying light. Then he sized up Li Fei Bai. He noticed that Li Fei Bai's battle armor was giving off an icy shine. He looked like a god in the space. Even the stars looked insignificant in front of him. Even Yi Shiwen was a bit cautious. After all, Li Fei Bai had already entered the pinnacle of the sage, small perfection realm. Moreover, he was only a step away from obtaining the strength of the sage, great perfection realm. Therefore, he was much more powerful than that fierce Starwolf King. Who are you? Where is Yan Hongyi? Li Fei Bai asked somewhat indifferently. Is he such a coward that he hasn't come himself and has sent an amateurish young boy instead? Get lost and ask him to come. Otherwise, I will go and trample his Piyuan Villa flat myself. Li Fei Bai had become restless. Yan Hongyi isn't here. So, the people I had sent to launch a raid on the Piyuan Villa must be in trouble. Don't bother. I have come to fight with you on behalf of Villa Lord Yan, Yi Shiwen stated. Who do you think you are? You don't deserve to fight with me. Li Fei Bai said disdainfully. I am the one who defeated the 5 Huang brothers. And you're saying that I don't deserve to fight with you? Yi Shiwen insipidly replied. What? You're the little bastard who injured my son? Li Fei Bai opened his eyes wide. To be continued. Chapter 534. A plus A. Chapter 534. Fights Li Fei Bai then. You'll have to pay the price with your life. Li Fei Bai sneered. He hadn't placed Yi Shiwen as his first target. After all, he had believed that the people of Piyuan Villa would have no choice but to die once he had killed Yan Hongyi. The person who had injured his son would be no exception either. However, he hadn't expected Yi Shiwen to appear before him instead of Yan Hongyi. So he had become enraged since things hadn't gone according to his plan. I hadn't expected that Yan Hongyi wouldn't come, and would instead send you to die. When did he become such a coward? Li Fei Bai spoke up in a disdainful manner as he belittled his old rival. He hasn't become a coward, but you're not worthy of fighting him. Yi Shiwen calmly replied. His lofty figure was standing tall in the space. Not worthy of fighting him. The first word that had come in the minds of the spectators after they heard this sentence was arrogant. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't some ordinary arrogant person. Li Fei Bai had an outstanding reputation in the Shanyang city. He had established supreme prestige since several hundred years. So, who would dare to say that he wasn't worthy? However, Yi Shiwen had indeed said it. Each of these spectators could rule over a region since they were sage experts. However, they didn't even dare to breathe loudly in front of these two supreme individuals. Moreover, they were afraid that the aftermath of this battle would blow them away. Not worthy? Those are big words. An insignificant expert of the intermediate stage of sage realm dares to act audaciously in front of an experienced man. Li Fei Bai sneered and said. His gaze pierced Yi Shiwen like a sword. Li Fei Bai's incomparably tyrannical aura swept out like a vast ocean. It surged forth overwhelmingly as it swept out towards Yi Shiwen. Golden waves suddenly appeared under Yi Zaiwen's feet as his aura swept towards Li Fei Bai. Bang! The two stunning, imposing auras collided in the space, and cracks proliferated in the surroundings from the point of collision. The space was left to crack like glass as a result. Many experts had been watching from afar. However, they were forced to retreat, especially some experts of the semi-sage realm since they still hadn't reached the sage realm. In fact, they had an even more frightened expression on their faces as compared to the sage realm experts around them. They retreated again and again. In fact, the aftershocks had even swept some of them away. They were even forced to defend themselves with their entire strength. After all, they would have gotten crushed by the aftershocks if they hadn't. You've got some skills. However, you're still a long way off from me. Li Fei Bai coldly shouted. Then he brandished a spear. He looked like a general who had been on expeditions for many years as he thrust his spear forward. The spear issued an incredibly stunning murderous aura that subsequently transformed into an evil dragon. The energy spread out in all directions. The dragon suddenly opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl and advanced towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. However, Yi Shiwen stood fearless and brandished his long sword. It was merely an ordinary sword. There was nothing fancy about it. And it didn't issue any gorgeous-looking divine beam either. Then, Yi Shiwen performed a simple sword attack. However, it still seemed that it would smash the world within a split second. The sword slash opened endless cracks as it went forward to face the incoming spear attack. Bang! The two weapons collided, and the sage-level spear in Li Fei Bai's hand issued incredible rays of light. However, Yi Zaiwen's iron sword pierced through those rays of light like the sunlight cuts through the darkness, and his sword eventually collided with the tip of the spear. Crack, crack! Numerous cracks appeared in the sky and left it to look like a spider's web. A killing intention flashed in Li Fei Bai's eyes as he saw that Yi Shiwen had blocked his attack. He had also realized that this young man's realm didn't matter. This young man possessed the strength of sage, small perfection realm, to say the least. And there was no doubt about this. This youth belonged to Piyuan Villa as per Li Fei Bai's knowledge, and it seemed that he had become very strong at a very young age. He hadn't merely maintained a youthful appearance like others had. Rather, he was genuinely very young. And such a person could pose a huge threat to him in the future if he was allowed to continue his cultivation. He clearly knew how terrifying such a person could become later on. Therefore, such a person had to be strangled in the cradle. He had to be killed before he could cause greater damage. The people of Li clan who were witnessing this duel also felt the same. The elite experts of the Li clan had gone to launch an attack on Piyuan Villa. However, some of them had arrived here along with their clan lord. It was hard for them to conceal the look of astonishment in their eyes. It would have been acceptable if it had been that famous and outstanding Yenhong Yi. After all, Villa Lord Yen had been able to contend against their clan lord in the past as well. However, this unknown young man had proved to be a match for their clan lord so far, and this was beyond their very imaginations. Some people of the Piyuan villa had also arrived to watch the fight. However, they also hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen would be able to block Li Fei Bei's attack. However, their confidence increased enormously once they saw that Yi Shiwen was handling this with ease. They had come prepared to die since they were determined to delay Li Fei by after he had won the fight. After all, they wanted to buy time for the evacuation of the villa. However, it suddenly seemed that they didn't need to think about dying just yet. Is that all you've got? Li Clan's clan lord, a man who has shaken the Shanyang city for several hundred years with his power. Does he only possesses this much strength? Yi Shiwen softly taunted. He had spoken this with disappointment and contempt. His voice wasn't loud. However, it had exploded in everyone's mind like thunder. Everyone was looking at Yi Zaiwen's slightly slim figure. However, nobody felt that he was too wild and rash anymore. In fact, he suddenly seemed to have the qualification to back such words. I didn't know that a young man who doesn't know the profoundness of this world could be so wild after making such a small accomplishment. I've seen many so-called geniuses like you. However, all of them have turned into dust. Li Fei Bei coldly replied. His words were sharp and penetrating. I've also seen many old dogs like you, dogs that have been practicing for several hundred years. I would have smashed you like an ant if I had gotten to even 1/10 of your cultivation time. Yi Shiwen sneered back in response. It could be said that he wasn't lacking when it came to glib talking. You're courting death. Li Fei Bei's face turned pale. This had poked a weak spot of his heart. Many outstanding geniuses had died in the past before they had even reached the sage realm. They had perished before they could make a name for themselves and proclaim themselves as hegemons. None of those peerless geniuses had survived, and he had managed to become the latecomer who had outlived his more deserving peers. Therefore, he had become the hegemon in this region, even though he was nothing but ordinary in comparison to his now dead peers. Indeed, many of his peers had died and turned into dust. However, those who had survived had risen to the point where he couldn't even look up to them. The spear in Li Fei Bei's hand issued endless spear beams, and they then swept out towards Yi Shiwen. He felt that such a person couldn't be left alive. Otherwise, it would be a huge disaster for him. Li Fei Bei's foundation possessed the accumulation of several hundred years. His foundation had become incredibly deep. A person like Yi Shiwen couldn't match this since he had reached this level within a short span of time. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid. His eyes looked deep, and his golden divinities crawled over his entire body as he raised his iron sword to face the attack. Bang! 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 The tips of the spear collided countless times with the iron sword within a split second. Li Fei Bei's spear was a sage tool that had been improved for countless years, and the iron sword in Yi Zaiwen's hand was an ordinary long sword. However, it had still revealed unimaginable might in his hand. The actions of both sides were getting increasingly faster. Li Fei Bei's realm was much higher than that of Yi Zaiwen's. However, Yi Zaiwen's body had already been toughened to a terrifying extent. Moreover, his attacking speed was at the peak because of his clear mind. The ruthless and tyrannical expression in Li Fei Bei's eyes intensified as the fight progressed. He had been underestimating Yi Shiwen so far. However, he had started to take him seriously now. In fact, he was becoming more and more afraid of Yi Shiwen. So, he had become even more determined to kill him. Bang! The tip of the spear collided with the sword in the space once again. Li Fei Bei didn't retreat. He instead stepped forward and ferociously leapt towards Yi Shiwen. He arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. Like lightning, the imposing aura of the spear in his hand made it appear as if it was a dragon. The dragon-like spear swept out and shattered the void as it thrust towards Yi Zaiwen's head. Go to hell! A sinister look appeared on Li Fei Bei's face as a crazed look flashed in his ice-cold eyes. However, Yi Zaiwen's speed wasn't any lesser, and he instantly responded by raising his sword to block the attack. Bang! Li Fei Bei's spear collided with the sword's body. Bang! The tip of Yi Zaiwen's iron sword broke down. After all, it was merely an ordinary iron sword. However, Yi Shiwen used his divine wisdom and mended it within the blink of an eye. His patchwork skill wasn't at a very high level. However, fortunately his sword was only an ordinary iron tool, so it could be repaired in a flash. Yi Shiwen didn't budge under Li Fei Bei's attack. He merely stood there motionless. On the contrary, Li Fei Bei was sent flying by a tremendous force, and his eyes were left to reveal an incomparably terrified look. How could his opponent have such terrifying strength? It was too frightening. There was no limit to how much scared he was right now. In fact, Yi Shiwen appeared like a super monster whose body was cloaked in human skin. After all, Yi Zaiwen's realm was far inferior to his. However, it was him who had gone out flying by the impact of this collision. Yi Zaiwen's toes moved slightly at this moment. Then his figure transformed into golden streamer and suddenly arrived in front of Li Fei Bei. He immediately used a very basic sword move, and his long sword transformed into a viper and rushed out. The attacking side and the defending side had switched places. The strengths of both parties had surpassed that of an average sage expert. They were fighting at a lightning-fast speed. They were moving so quickly that an ordinary person couldn't even track their movements. Bang! 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 Cracks appeared in the void every time they clashed. Li Fei Bei's offensives became more and more urgent. However, Yi Zaiwen's defensives were impenetrable. Both individuals had gone all out. However, it still wasn't possible to determine the clear winner. Who is this man? How has he proven to be a match for Li Fei Bei? Many people were in doubt. After all, they didn't know how Yi Shiwen was managing to hold his own against Li Fei Bei to this extent. In fact, Yi Zaiwen's strength was enough to scare a person to death. Yeah, it's insane. We mustn't go near them while they are fighting. Otherwise, we may get suppressed to death by the aftershocks of their fight. It's no wonder that they are fighting in the space. The Shanyang city wouldn't have been able to withstand such an intense battle. Li Fei Bei wasn't calm like Yi Shiwen. After all, he was failing to defeat Yi Shiwen. So, he had gradually become very anxious. Moreover, Yan Hong was probably still in Piyuan Villa since Yi Shiwen was here. And this meant that the experts he had sent to destroy Piyuan Villa would have bumped into Yan Hong by now. They would have landed into big trouble as a result. And they would probably suffer heavy losses if things didn't change very quickly. A crazed look appeared in his eyes as he realized this. Boy, you are courting death. To be continued. Chapter 535. Li Fei Bei had decided to better not delay any further. After all, it was hard to say how things would turn out to be if he continued to delay. A dangerous aura began to permeate into the surroundings from his body. Then, thick hair began to sprout on his body, and they soon covered his body entirely. Consequently, he started to look like a hairy monster from afar. In fact, Yi Shiwen even got some Star Beast vibes from his body. How has Li Fei Bei transformed into this? Isn't he human? Someone among those spectators who were watching this fight from afar had gotten scared. In fact, that boundless and ominous aura had scared a lot of people. This is Li Fei Bei's special ability. He can transform into a beast man, and his strength increases enormously after he has had this transformation. I've heard that he had once sucked the blood of a star beast. That's how he obtained this special ability. Yi Shiwen frowned as he looked at Li Fei Bai. After all, he had become even more dangerous after becoming the Beast Man. He was very unscrupulous. To think he'd even transform into a monster in order to gain strength. Young man, I haven't undergone this transformation for more than 100 years. But you have forced me to take this step today. So, I can say that you're pretty good. However, that's all that you could have done. It's over now. Li Fei Bai coldly stated. The hair on his body had become even thicker and longer. In fact, he bore no resemblance to his original appearance now. He had radically transformed into a hairy and humanoid monster. Bang! Li Fei Bai suddenly trod forward, and numerous cracks appeared in the space. He had used a dreadful reactive force to propel himself forward. His body had grown much bigger after the transformation, and his speed had also increased significantly. He arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. Then, the spear in his hand issued an ear-piercing sound and swept out towards Yi Shiwen. Whoosh! Yi Shiwen simply raised his hand and grabbed that spear. The tip of the spear struck his palm, and this collision issued a metal clanging sound. Vigorous, real, elemental energy gathered in the middle, and then swept swirling across in the air. It opened a huge crack in the void. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they witnessed the scene. The fight had become even more intense than before. Neither of these two individuals was letting up. It had seemed that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to withstand Li Fei Bai and would be defeated very quickly. However, Yi Shiwen had become increasingly calm. In fact, it seemed as if Li Fei Bai couldn't give him any trouble even after he had turned into a beast man. Crack! A huge mountain fell from above as the intense sound of breaking of space was heard. It then swept down towards Li Fei Bai. It was the Han seal. However, Li Fei Bai reacted very quickly. He broke away from Yi Shiwen's entanglement. He then trod away and escaped from the range of Han seal's bombardment. Rumble! The Han seal bombarded, and the entire space in its attack range sunk in and collapsed like a sinkhole. The spectators held their breaths. The Han seal had shattered the space in a large area. This technique had indeed carried enormous might. Buried person's sword. Li Fei Bai had barely avoided the attack of the Han seal when he heard an ice-cold shout in his ears. Ha! 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 Sword energies formed in the space and then spread out to cover everything in the range as they swept towards Li Fei Bai. They swept over like an overwhelming wave. Whoosh! 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 Li Fei Bai unceasingly brandished his spear in order to block those sword energies. However, each of those swords had carried enormous power. In fact, it seemed as if they would pierce the world itself. The palm with which Li Fei Bai held the spear had been badly mutilated. Each incoming sword energy appeared like a small mountain as he tackled them. It was like facing a barrage of hills. Li Fei Bai became extremely scared in his heart. How can someone have such terrifying strength? He's like a beast disguised as a human. It was a strange scene to behold. Li Fei Bai looked like a monster. However, he was retreating under the continuous sword attacks of the slim-looking Yi Shiwen. Everyone found it absurd. Who's the real monster? This question had aroused in everyone's minds. Bang! Li Fei Bai faced the raid of the sword energies once again. However, he couldn't dodge them this time and went out flying by the explosion. He collided with a nearby meteorite, and the meteorite got shattered by the impact. It wasn't clear how long it had been since the fight had started. However, Yi Shiwen had gotten complete control over it. Li Fei Bai had appeared very powerful at first. However, he had been suppressed by Yi Shiwen and had been retreating again and again. Ha! A golden figure flashed in front of Li Fei Bai. Yi Shiwen had rushed over and had appeared in front of him. Then his iron sword slashed down and cut open a pitch-black rift as it fell down on Li Fei Bai. It's over. Everyone's eyes became wide open as this thought appeared in their minds. After all, this outcome was beyond their wildest imaginations. However, it looked inevitable and a matter of fact in a way. It was beyond everyone's imagination because they had believed that it would be a one-sided contest in which Li Fei Bai would be victorious. In fact, no one had thought that he would fall into a disadvantageous position. However, this outcome had later seemed inevitable because everyone had realized that Yi Shiwen had maintained the upper hand since the beginning of the fight. The people who had been watching this fight hadn't been sure how long ago the fight had started. However, they were sure that Yi Shiwen had suppressed Li Fei by the entire duration of the fight. Therefore, this outcome couldn't be considered as strange. Bang! The sound of an explosion stirred the entire space. A blood-red figure emerged from it. It carried a dreadful and ominous aura. Li Fei Bai hadn't been killed by Yi Ziwen's move. Instead, he had moved away from the range of Yi Ziwen's attack. Moreover, his stature had become increasingly large, and his entire body looked blood-red. He had previously transformed into a big and hairy monster. However, he hadn't transformed completely, but he had completed his transformation and had now become a blood-red demon beast. He looked hideous and vicious. It was hard to say which demon beast's blood he had swallowed that had made him so terrifying. Li Fei Bai's body had transformed completely, and everyone could feel the dangerous aura on his body. The real elemental energy swept out uncontrollably from his body. It then swirled around and distorted the vast space. Even the light had gotten distorted. It was a humanoid demon beast. Die, kid! Li Fei Bai roared in a low voice as the blood of the beast rushed into his brain. Consequently, his consciousness became a bit fuzzy, and he became even fiercer. His eyes had also turned a deeper shade of red and looked very ominous. His eyes were fixated on Yi Shiwen. Nobody had ever forced him to undergo the complete transform. He knew that the complete transformation would harm his body greatly. However, he didn't have any other option at this time. Moreover, everything was worth the risk as long as he could kill Yi Shiwen on the spot. Tyrant Heavenly Demon Spear! Li Fei Bai shouted. Terrifying real elemental energy began to surge on his body, and his spear shot out within a split second. It ripped apart the void and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. The extremely terrifying force of the spear had shattered the space, and the space didn't even get enough time to repair itself. Big Bang Stardust Fist! Yi Shiwen shouted in a deep voice. The star power began to boil on his entire body. Then, some amount of star power boiled out from his small universe. It seemed as if his small universe had expanded countless times in a split second as it swept out. This was his universe, and it had enveloped Li Fei Bai in a flash. There were only two individuals inside this universe, Yi Shiwen and Li Fei Bai. Yi Shiwen was the only true god in this universe, and Li Fei Bai was a great devil who wanted to destroy the world. Boom! Yi Ziwen's fist transformed into a huge star and swept down. It then collided with Li Fei Bai's spear. The space couldn't bear this collision and collapsed as a result. Yi Ziwen's universe had also begun to distort at a rapid pace. A huge mushroom cloud rose in the universe, and rays of light swept out and dazzled many spectators. They screamed and hid away since the rays of light were unbearably bright. These experts of sage and semi-sage realm had found it hard to withstand this. A huge storm had been set off by the impact of the mushroom cloud. A figure went out flying upside down as the storm dispersed. His entire body was covered with blood. Everyone stared at this figure to find out who it was. Isn't that Li Fei Bai? Old Li Fei Bai spouted blood from his mouth. He had gone out flying in front of everyone. His entire body had turned red. However, it wasn't because of his long and red hair. It was because of the blood that had gushed out from the pores of his body. In fact, it appeared as if he was made entirely out of blood. Li Fei Bai couldn't maintain his appearance of a beast man after he had sustained these severe injuries. So his long hair returned inside his body as he transformed back into his human form. Li Fei Bai couldn't conceal that look of terror within his eyes this time. Other people hadn't witnessed everything clearly. However, he had experienced Yi Zaiwen's ferocious strength firsthand. His body had become as ferocious as that of a star beast after he had transformed into the beast man. However, he had still appeared weak in front of Yi Shiwen. The beast man hadn't even been able to perform better than the human Li Fei Bai. In fact, his internal organs had been ruptured by Yi Shiwen in just one move. He isn't human. He's a monster draped in a man's skin. Crack! People hadn't even reacted when they heard a shrill sound of breaking of space. Then, a blood-red spear suddenly fell down from above. Pucci! Everyone was still distracted when that blood-red spear cut through Li Fei Bai's defensives and pierced his heart. The entire space had suddenly turned quiet. In fact, there was a deathly silence. After all, an expert of Sage Small Perfection Realm had been impaled to death in the space. They had seen the entire fight with their own eyes. There hadn't been any fanciness to it. Li Fei Bai had been suppressed in this fight from the beginning. He hadn't had the power to fight back. And it didn't matter how formidable a strength he had revealed, it was simply not enough. He had been suppressed by Yi Shiwen and had ultimately been impaled to death. The faces of the experts of the Li clan had turned ashen after they witnessed their clan lord being suppressed and eventually killed by Yi Shiwen. The entire population of the Piyuan villa were dependent upon Yanhong Yi. Similarly, the people of Li clan had also solely depended on Li Fei Bai. Li clan's background was comparatively more profound than the Piyuan villa's. However, it still wasn't that much better. The faces of the Piyuan villa's experts revealed a look of excitement. They felt elated. After all, a huge stone had finally been lifted from their chests. This incident obviously caused a huge sensation in the Shangyang city. To be continued. Chapter 536. Chapter 536. Great Gas Building. Li Fei Bai is dead? He died at the hands of a mysterious man. Who is this man? How can he be so outstanding? I hadn't expected that such an expert would be hiding inside the Piyuan villa. The experts trembled as they saw Yi Zaiwen's slim figure from behind. His slim figure looked majestic, whereas Li Fei Bai's figure looked like a tragic painting that had been nailed in the space. Soon after, another piece of information proliferated in the Shangyang city. Li clan's great elder had been killed by Yanhong Yi. In fact, no one had survived among those elite experts of the Li clan who had launched a raid on the Piyuan villa. The Li clan is finished. Their two top experts have died along with a large number of other elite experts. The Li clan is now doomed. Li clan's decline was the most popular topic in the Shangyang city for a month. Li clan's clan lord, Li Fei Bai, had been impaled to death before everyone's eyes by Yi Shiwen. This news had shaken the entire Shangyang city. Li Fei Bai was a powerful and arrogant hegemon of the Shangyang city. He was about to make the breakthrough into the Sage Great Perfection Realm. In fact, he would have dominated the entire Shangyang city after he had done so. However, he had been killed in a battle. The entire Shangyang city was seething because of this news. Everyone had become extremely excited. However, there hadn't been any fanciness to the battle. Li Fei Bai had been forced into a disadvantageous position and then impaled to death. The Piyuan villa was solely dependent upon Yanhong Yi. However, the Li clan was different from a newly emerging force like Piyuan villa. After all, the Li clan was 1,000 years old and was regarded as a luxuriant force in the Shangyang city. How could it be that easy to destabilize it? The great elder of Li clan was another sage, small perfection level expert. He had been killed by Yan Hong Yi after Li Fei Bei's death. Even those other elite experts who had launched a raid on Piyuan Villa hadn't been able to escape. All of them had been killed. The death of Li Fei Bei alone wouldn't have been enough to collapse the Li clan. However, 2 senior experts of Sage, Small Perfection Realm had died along with many other elite experts, and the Li clan had thoroughly declined as a result. The remaining members of the Li clan had been expelled from the Shanyang city in a matter of few days, and the slow runners had been killed. Moreover, the Piyuan Villa wasn't the only force that had attacked them after this incident. It was hard to tell how many people Li clan had offended during its prolonged dominance in the Shanyang city. Nobody had dared to say anything to Li Fei Bei and his men because of Li clan's integrated power. However, those previously hidden enemies had emerged after the Li clan support pillar had been eliminated. The Li clan that had enjoyed an illustrious reputation for 1,000 years had been uprooted within the short time of 1 month. And this had shaken the entire Shanyang city. Those 1,000-year-old or 10,000-year-old clans might be extremely tyrannical for ordinary people. However, this incident had made everyone realize that even such clans were nothing for genuine experts. A force that was dependent on its millennium-old strength had become a big joke in front of true tyrannical strength. Everyone was happy in Piyuan Villa since such a big problem had been resolved. They felt as if a huge rock had been lifted from their chests. Moreover, they didn't need to worry about facing destruction anymore. Yan Hong Yi showed gratitude towards Yi Shiwen in his study room inside the villa. He said, "We were fortunate that young brother Yi saved the entire Piyuan Villa this time. It's a huge favor. I don't have words to thank you. It's no big deal. It was very easy. Moreover, I was somewhat responsible for this whole mess." Yi Shiwen waved his hand as he replied. It had been a month since the battle. However, this was the first time that Yan Hong was talking to Yi Shiwen since then, and that was because he had been bedridden this entire time. That great elder of Li clan had entered the Sage Small Perfection realm only recently. However, Yan Hong had been suffering from old injuries, so he hadn't been in his peak condition. Therefore, he had sustained serious injuries in an earth-shattering fight with that great elder. Consequently, he had been bedridden for an entire month. In fact, he had only somewhat recovered even now. Yan Hong had decided to revel for a while. He had only brought a person along with him so that they could spend some time together and have fun. However, that person had ended up saving his Piyuan Villa. This represented the so-called saying, lead a leisurely life, drinking and enjoying, and leave everything in God's hands. Forgive my audacity for asking young brother Yi to come here so untimely. I have something that I would like to request you to do. Yan Hong sincerely essayed. Please say. Yi Shiwen replied, the great gas building in our River Shore Starfield is about to open very soon. I would like to request young brother Yi to visit it if he doesn't mind. Yan Hong said, where is this great gas building? Yi Shiwen asked. Great gas building is the most magical place in our star region. It is said that an almighty force had left behind a divine tool long time ago, and that tool is locked at that place in our star region. Many people leave for the great gas building every time it opens, and many people have gained enormous benefits there. Some of them have skyrocketed and become top-notch experts of their generation. Yan Hong explained. However, only a limited number of people can enter the great gas building. The 10 people who possess the maximum strength and the most outstanding innate talent get the approval to enter that place. I can see that young brother Yi is very young. However, your strength is enough to awe the entire world. Your innate talent must also be outstanding. So, you definitely have a chance. Yan Hong continued. I'm also telling you this because of my selfish motive. There's a strip of domain called the Great Gas Collar in the immense domain surrounding the Great Gas Building. One can find different kinds of precious treasures inside that strip of domain. However, fierce beasts and demon beasts are also present there. My wife is seriously injured, and I need the green scaled fruit for her treatment. I believe that it can be found there because someone had once obtained it from there. I had previously planned to go there alone. However, my injuries haven't healed yet. Therefore, I won't be able to go there in such a condition. I hope that young brother Yi will pay a little bit attention to this matter. I will be very much grateful to you if you do so. Yan Hong Yi bowed again to show gratitude towards Yi Xuan. Green scaled fruit, great gas collar. He had heard about this matter from Yan Hong Yi in the past. Yan Hong Yi had originally planned to go there alone. However, he had sustained a lot of injuries after having been in several fights. The records of this great gas collar were present in the Northern Dipper's secret map that Yi Xuan possessed. However, the Northern Dipper didn't have much information on the great gas building. They only recorded legends that said that a god had left behind a divine tool at this place. Many people had obtained heritages whenever the great gas building had opened. Moreover, many different heritages had been found there. Power techniques, divine tools, and many other precious treasures had also been found. Yi Xuan didn't wish to miss the opportunity to go to the great gas building, since he wanted to increase his strength by leaps and bounds within a short span of time. Yi Xuan left Shangyang City, while the entire city was still immersed in the shock of Li Clan's collapse. He had once again set foot on his journey back to the true martial university after bidding farewell to Yan Hong Yi and the others. A golden light streaked across the space as a young man dressed in green clothes shuttled in the space at an astonishing speed. A pair of golden wings was fluttering on his back, and the sound of wind and thunder faintly echoed every time his wings fluttered. The spirit energies transformed into an astral wind and blew against his face. The wind blew his clothes, and a flapping sound echoed. He had enhanced his devil wings to an entirely different level. So, he swept out wind and thunder as his wings fluttered. Moreover, it could be said that this magical power resembled the wind and thunder wings of the legendary character Lei Jinzi. Yi Mo had once mentioned about the wind and thunder wings. However, Yi Xuan had made fun of him. How could something as primitive as wind and thunder wings be the superior form of his devil wings? After all, the wind and thunder wings merely showed the beginning of magical power and nothing more. It seemed that time had passed very quickly, since only a few years were left to prepare for his appointment with Chao Yu. Therefore, Yi Xuan couldn't relax even a bit. He had finally reached the peak of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm, and he was about to enter the late stage of Sage Realm. He would be able to blast away even the experts of the Sage Great Perfection Realm after his next breakthrough. His fighting strength was one step away from entering the Sage Great Perfection Realm. Perhaps Chao Yu had underestimated Yi Xuan when he had issued the declaration of war. Chao Yu had already become a top-tier expert of the Sage Realm at that time. However, Yi Xuan hadn't even reached the Sage Realm. Chao Yu had issued the declaration of war because he wanted to kill Yi Xuan in front of everyone. After all, this would allow him to establish the law enforcement hall's prestige. He has miscalculated. Yi Xuan secretly muttered. Yi Xuan was no longer that boy who had barely been able to withstand the impact of Chao Yu's war declaration. He had been continuously bridging the gap between himself and Chao Yu. However, he didn't need to look up anymore. In fact, he would be able to look his opponent in the eye sooner or later, or even overlook him. However, he also remembered Mu Xingjie. That guy had once fought with the Big Brother for the hegemony, and even the Big Brother hadn't been able to suppress him in a proper manner. Moreover, he has obtained many enormous benefits from the ancient ruins, and he will become even more ferocious once he comes out of the closed-door training. Yi Xuan was more wary of Mu Xingjie as compared to Chao Yu. Perhaps Yi Xuan was nothing more than a clown who jumped around for an expert of Mu Xingjie's caliber. Even an expert of the sage, great perfection realm would seem only slightly stronger than an ant to him. Yi Shiwen became even more afraid as these thoughts crossed his mind. Crushing ants was no big deal when compared to killing fellow human beings. I would be treated as an ant if I am not strong enough, and I would then get crushed to death. Yi Shiwen looked far into the distance with a cold look in his eyes. It didn't matter whether it was Chao Yiu or Mu Shengjie. He wouldn't let them off if they wanted to harm him. Their plots to murder him wouldn't kill him. Instead, they would only make him stronger. Wait until I return. I will give them a big surprise. Suddenly, waves of scarlet light began to emanate from Yi Zaiwen's body. This made his body shine red and made him look like a bloody shadow. Yi Shiwen, where are you going? Yi Mo's voice reverberated inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. What's your recovery status? Yi Shiwen asked. I've recovered, at least 70 to 80%. Yi Mo laughed and replied. Countless sage experts had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands during these few years of expeditions. Not many of those sage experts had possessed sage tools. However, the number of sage tools he had acquired was still significantly large, and all those sage tools had been devoured by Yi Mo along with their tool spirits. It was clear that Yi Mo had become much more conscious after he had swallowed Li Fei Bei's sage level spear as well. To be continued. Chapter 537. Chapter 537. Dispute is about to begin. The Heavenly Source Mirror has leveled up quickly and has become a great sage tool after it has swallowed so many sage tools. Yi Mo merrily stated. Great sage tool and sage tool were two entirely different concepts. In fact, there was a difference of cloud and mud between them. Yi Mo had sustained injuries to his essence. However, the Heavenly Source Mirror had nothing to do with that. In fact, Yi Shiwen hadn't seen the injuries affecting the essence of the Heavenly Source Mirror. Therefore, Yi Mo had swallowed the tool spirits of many sage tools in order to replenish his essence. It was similar to when Yi Shu had swallowed other book demons in order to strengthen his essence. Basically, all living things possess the ability to consume another life and assimilate it into theirs. However, the extent to which they do it isn't the same. The human race also possesses a version of this ability, the so-called you become what you eat theory. However, the extent of food consumption isn't so exaggerated in their case. After all, humans can't devour and assimilate food in its entirety like these demons and spirits can. The Heavenly Source Mirror had swallowed the remaining sage tools. It was impossible for an ordinary divine tool to level up like that. It could be said that the Heavenly Source Mirror had grown up automatically. After all, an ordinary divine tool required the constant support of its owner to add materials. Moreover, special sacrificial techniques also needed to be utilized for it to progress. However, Yi Shiwen didn't need to worry about these things because Yi Mo had taken care of these things by himself. In fact, Yi Shiwen felt that Yi Mo could have used the Heavenly Source Mirror as his main body and could have cultivated to become a peerless and great devil. After all, this was very much a possibility. That's awesome! Yi Shiwen burst into laughter and replied. The Heavenly Source Mirror would undoubtedly become his trump card since it had advanced and become a great sage tool. It would be like a trump card that is hidden at the bottom of the deck. In fact, it would be enough to insta-kill his opponents. What are you planning to do next? Yi Mo asked. I'm planning to visit this great gas building. I want to have a look. The expression in Yi Zaiwen's eyes looked exceptionally firm as he replied. He could have returned to the true Marshall University through the Northern Dippers transportation portal. However, he had decided to postpone that because he wanted to test his limits and gain practical experiences before he returned to the true Marshall University. This represented the so-called saying reading 10,000 books isn't equal to walking 10,000 miles on the road. There were a lot of matters that couldn't be understood by undergoing closed-door training alone. The Great Gas Building was undoubtedly the most famous place in the entire River Shore star field. The Great Gas Building attracted powerful experts from all corners of the River Shore star field. It had been famous for countless years now. This place certainly had many treasures, and they would provide a big boost to Yishiwen since he has always had to face great difficulties in order to promote his strength. Yishiwen also had the assistance of his blood slave. The blood slave now controlled the body of the star colossus. So Yishiwen was confident that he would be able to escape even if he were to come across a great sage expert. The world was so big, and he could go anywhere. Anyway, I can see that you have plentiful real elemental energy. Moreover, you've already reached the peak of the intermediate stage of Sage Realm. Therefore, it would be better if you first look for a place to train. You should try to break through the threshold of the late stage of Sage Realm. You will feel much more confident if you go to Great Building after that. Yiemo said. Yi Shiwen used his divine sense and shared some information about the Great Gas Building with him. Okay. Yi Shiwen nodded. He had the assistance of his blood slave, and his blood slave had become extremely powerful after it had started to control the star colossus. However, promoting his own strength would still take a lot of time. Moreover, he couldn't rely too much on others. The River Shore star field was vast, and there was a big region in its depths which was called the Great Gas Collar. The Great Gas Collar was gigantic. However, it was perennially packed with a poisonous fog. Even the great sage experts didn't dare to venture into this region carelessly. Otherwise, they would be corroded to death. The Great Gas Building was located at the center of the Great Gas Collar. Some people said that the Great Gas Building was a divine tool, while some people said that it was the residence of a god. However, everyone agreed that the Great Gas Building was full of mysteries. The Great Gas Collar remained packed with poisonous fog all the time. It opened once every 50 years. Many old fogies would come out of their closed-door training and would rush to this place whenever it opened because there were countless precious treasures present at this place. And they could possibly make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm if they were to obtain even a small number of those treasures. However, the Great Sage experts didn't dare to approach the Great Gas Collar. They would get suppressed as soon as they entered it. It didn't matter how formidable a Great Sage expert was. They would be demoted to the Sage Great Perfection Realm if they entered the Great Gas Collar. Moreover, there wasn't any exception to this. This effect was absolute. Moreover, once a Great Sage expert who had ventured into the Great Gas Collar had been targeted and killed by several experts of the Sage Great Perfection Realm inside the Great Gas Collar. Therefore, no Great Sage expert had dared to set foot in the Great Gas Collar since then. Initially, the Great Sage experts weren't so scared of the Great Gas Collar. After all, they still carried the experience and perception of a Great Sage expert, even if they had been suppressed by the effects of Great Gas Collar and demoted to the Sage Great Perfection Realm. So, ordinary experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm would still be no match for them. Therefore, many Great Sage experts would visit the Great Gas Collar. The ordinary experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm were no match for them and would get tortured to death by these Great Sage experts. However, the ordinary experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm had later joined hands and had killed a Great Sage expert who had ventured into the Great Gas Collar. And no Great Sage expert had dared to enter the Great Gas Collar since then. After all, how could they make such a mistake with so much wealth on their body? Therefore, the Great Gas Collar had become very famous for being able to suppress Great Sage experts. Its notoriety had even spread in the nearby star regions. It was a famous restricted zone for Great Sage experts. Yi Shiwen was looking over the information collected by Yen Hong Yi on the Great Gas Collar. However, he had also become apprehensive about going to the Great Gas Collar after he had come to know that even a Great Sage expert had died inside this place. Great Sage experts were very different from ordinary Sage experts. all great sage experts were famous in their respective regions. However, they had been suppressed at this place, and one of them had even died here. This represented the so-called saying a dragon swimming in the shallow waters is toyed by prawns, and a tiger fallen flat on the ground is bullied by the dogs. This place was extremely mysterious. Yi Shiwen flew quickly for another month, and finally sensed the great gas collar. However, the first thing that had caught his attention was an incomparably large city. It appeared as if a huge continent was floating in the space. The city looked like a giant beast hidden in the space, and it extended as far as one could see. In fact, it looked like a star colossus. The cities in the space were often much bigger than the cities on various planets. This was because the space had a harsh environment. Therefore, a lot of people lived in a region together. Moreover, there weren't any topographical limitations, so the cities grew in size with time. However, this city was even bigger than Shenyang City. In fact, it seemed to be touching the sky. The city walls were so tall that one couldn't even see the edges. This was the only city in the vicinity of the Great Gas Collar. Therefore, it was known as the Great Gas City. It had also become popular because of the Great Gas Collar. Yi Shiwen entered the city without any hesitation. The Great Gas City was very lively at this time since the Great Gas Collar was about to open. The experts from various regions had rushed over here en masse. The experts could be easily found everywhere in the city. The majority of these experts were ordinary sage experts. The great sage experts couldn't enter the Great Gas Collar. Therefore, it was a great opportunity to shine for these ordinary sage experts. Yi Shiwen entered a restaurant to rest for a while. Then, he let out Xiaoya from the heavenly source mirror. He had put Xiaoya inside the heavenly source mirror since he had been in a hurry to get to this place. The heavenly source mirror could be regarded as a self-sufficient space at present. It wasn't very big. However, it had enough area for Xiaoya to perform a wide range of activities. Xiaoya had advanced in these 2 months and had entered the 6th layer of the Xiantian realm. Yi Shiwen envied her progress. However, he couldn't do anything about it. There were too many geniuses in this world, like fishes in the ocean. Pangyang Bo had become a heaven's pride expert at the age of 11 or 12. Yi Shiwen would have no time left to do anything else in his life if he started to envy each and every one of these geniuses. The entire restaurant was unusually crowded at this time. Yi Shiwen and Xiao Yu were rather unnoticeable and hadn't attracted anyone's attention. After all, there were too many experts here. Moreover, it was full of strange people. One could tell that there was an enormous difference in the living environments of these strange experts. The majority of the people had black hair and black eyes. However, some of them had purple hair or red eyes. But these strange-looking people also seemed to have blended into the crowd. Someone there had mentioned that these bizarre-looking people probably had some relations with a bereaved race. And someone had also said that their living environment must have been responsible for such a change in their appearance. Everyone had different opinions. However, this was nothing but an ordinary matter. Yi Shiwen wasn't surprised. He had seen white, black, brown, and all other types of people on the earth. Xiao Yu wasn't concerned about these matters either. In fact, she didn't seem to care about anything besides Yi Shiwen. The Great Gas Collar is finally about to open. I have been waiting here for more than a year, but my wait is finally over. Yeah, the Great Gas Collar has already begun to spit out some heavenly treasures. Yi Shiwen had been listening. Apparently, the Great Gas Collar was known to unceasingly spit out heavenly treasures whenever it was about to open. At that time, the entire territory would shake, and it would seem as if those heavenly treasures were falling from it. A lot of people had arrived as early as 1 year before the opening so that they could find a favorable spot and capture those falling heavenly treasures. Of course, sometimes demon beasts also used to get spat out. One could obtain rare treasures if they were lucky, and they might bump into those demon beasts and get torn to pieces by them if they were unlucky. In fact, the chances of that happening were very high. However, these experts were basically desperados who would do anything for their cultivation. Many of them were random cultivators with no backgrounds. They didn't have many resources at their disposal. Therefore, they had to strive for everything that they required. Yi Shiwen was also like them in this regard. I will go to observe in a while. I wish to see what all heavenly treasures are going to come out. He, it will be an easy task to gain riches and honor if I manage to obtain some. Humph. Riches and honor? I think you won't die. Someone disdainfully sneered and replied, You think it is some great place? Beware. You will be doomed if some demon beasts appear instead of those pathetic heavenly treasures. Who was that? Which bastard said this? Come out and face me if you have the guts. I dare you. That man stood up and shouted. Why wouldn't I dare to show a reckless fool like you his place? I don't know how many arrogant men like you die every day. That expert who had sneered suddenly stood up and shouted. The entire restaurant immediately became noisy. It seemed that one wrong sentence would lead to a big fight in a place like this. The other experts who were present inside the restaurant also became vigilant and stood up one after another. The sixth vibration has begun! A loud shout came from outside the city and traveled far and wide. To be continued. Chapter 538. The entire restaurant had suddenly begun to seethe with excitement. Everyone had forgotten about that little fight after the great gas collar had begun to vibrate. After all, it had vibrated for the 6th time. The great gas collar used to vibrate 9 times before opening. Each vibration lasted for almost a month. Heavenly treasures and demon beasts used to appear on the edge of the great gas collar because of the vibrations during this time. And it depended on a person's luck whether they would come across a fortuitous treasure or a disaster. The entire restaurant had emptied within a few moments. Yi Shiwen had also gotten mixed among them. He flew out of the great gas city and went in the direction of great gas collar. The great gas collar appeared in front of him in a short span of time. The great gas city was like a colossus floating in the space as Yi Shiwen had originally felt. However, the great gas collar looked like a boundless continent floating in the space by that measure. It looked infinite. It looked like a vast floating continent that had been surrounded by a poisonous fog. Yi Shiwen had barely arrived when he saw a guy getting corroded to death by that poisonous fog. That guy hadn't believed the rumors about this place. He had thought that he'd be able to storm into the great gas collar with the help of his sage tool. However, he and his sage tool had gotten corroded by the poisonous fog. That guy's screams had shaken the void. There were many other experts who hadn't believed the rumors either and had thought about entering the great gas collar. But all of them suddenly stopped at their places. However, these people were daredevils whose cultivations had reached the sage realm, and each one of them was proud and arrogant. So, how could they stop because of fear? They obviously weren't going to give up. Puff! A streamer of light spouted from the great gas collar. It has started. It has started spitting. The great gas collar had begun to spout heavenly treasures. All the experts suddenly went crazy because of this. A dozen of the sage experts scrambled to capture those treasures. They rushed towards that streamer one after another. However, more than half of those experts hadn't even reached close to that streamer before they had been attacked by the other experts. And not a single person among them survived this sudden ambush. Roar! A roar came from that streamer. The divine light dispersed and revealed a ferocious demon beast. Its ominous energy looked dreadful. Then that beast opened its mouth like a huge sacrificial bowl and sucked ferociously. A few sage experts in the vicinity started to run quickly. However, they couldn't escape and got swallowed by that beast. That demon beast's speed was insanely fast. It had killed those unlucky sage experts in an instant, and a river of blood started to flow in the space as corpses floated everywhere. The demon beast swaggered away after it had killed those experts. It's too ferocious. This demon beast must be 10 times or even 100 times more ferocious than the star beasts, someone said in fear. Fortunately, that person hadn't rushed towards the streamer. Otherwise, they would also have met their end like those other people. Many of the remaining experts decided that they wouldn't hurriedly rush up. They would first see what was coming out. Otherwise, they could also come across such a tragedy. They had realized that gambling with their lives wouldn't be enough to capture those heavenly treasures. Those ordinary experts had met with a cruel and bloody end. However, this was how the ordinary experts used to survive. After all, they didn't have an abundance of resources like those Heaven's Pride experts. So they had to rely on themselves for everything. This place is very weird. One has to put their life on stake to fight for a bright future, Yi Shiwen secretly said. Moreover, this wasn't even the most dangerous time. The most dangerous time would come after they had entered the great gas collar. Yi Shiwen waited for a long time before a streamer finally emerged out. A mighty aura dissipated in the surroundings. It seemed that a demon beast had come out once again. Everyone stopped in their tracks, since they didn't wish to throw away their lives. Yi Shiwen concentrated his real elemental energy in his eyes, and he saw that a golden feather was wrapped up inside that streamer. The Phoenix regeneration technique had begun to operate automatically inside his body almost immediately after he had seen that feather. Yi Shiwen, quickly go and grab it. It's a phoenix feather. Yimo's voice reverberated inside Yi Zaiwen's mind. He didn't wait for Yi Mo to speak further. A pair of wings suddenly opened at his back. He then transformed into a streamer of light and rushed forward. Some people had been gloating since they had thought that the streamer contained a ferocious beast. However, Yi Shiwen smacked open the streamer and exposed the phoenix feather in front of them. Then the phoenix feather got sucked into the heavenly source mirror. Stop him. He has obtained a phoenix feather. Someone reacted quickly and shouted. A bunch of dreadful and imposing auras rushed towards Yi Shiwen from every direction. These sage experts hadn't held back their imposing auras even a bit. Their auras carried incredible power and surrounded Yi Shiwen. A few of those experts were very fast, and they had arrived in front of Yi Shiwen very quickly. Yi Shiwen sneered as his body began to leak golden divinities. The golden waves looked mighty and enormous, and his murderous aura looked frightening. Bang! A late-stage sage expert, who was the fastest among them, had already arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. However, a big hand fell down from above and grabbed him. The gigantic hand pinched him and made his body explode. That late-stage sage expert had been reduced to a mass of blood fog as a result. Then the divinities took the form of a giant wave under Yi Zaiwen's feet and surged forward. It seemed as if a star had pounded with an incredible force. The other experts who had rushed towards Yi Shiwen got drowned out by this golden wave. The rest of the experts found Yi Shiwen to be extremely ferocious. They couldn't possibly dare to go after him. After all, it would be akin to courting death. They were certainly wild. However, they weren't idiots. They knew that they didn't have any chance of winning. Yi Shiwen picked up Xiaoya, turned around and left. He had felt the divine sense of a sage, great perfection level expert sweeping over here. Their aura was getting increasingly close. So, it was evident that a senior expert of sage, great perfection realm was coming. Yi Zaiwen's current strength was enough to sweep away an expert of sage, small perfection realm. However, he could barely resist a sage, great perfection level expert. His speed became extremely fast once the demon wings opened, and he returned to the great gas city in a matter of moments. This place is in chaos. There are no rules or restrictions. There is only one rule, and that is strength rules. Yi Shiwen secretly said. After all, everyone was fighting frantically for their future. Yi Shiwen, you got very lucky this time. It is clear that this phoenix feather is from a pure-blood phoenix. It would be an enormous benefit for your phoenix regeneration technique if you were to refine it, Yi Mo said. This was also why he had told Yi Shiwen to grab it. The great gas collar spouted different kinds of magical items for the entire month. Some people had skyrocketed after they had obtained those treasures. However, the majority of people had died there. They had either died in the mouths of those demon beasts or they had been killed by other experts. Yi Shiwen had moved into action many times in this 1 month, and he had also obtained some heavenly treasures. They weren't extremely precious. However, they were very rare. Yi Shiwen hadn't missed any target since he had the assistance of Yi Mo by his side. Moreover, he would never grab the wrong item. However, he had also encountered a very dangerous situation once when he had been tracked down by a senior expert of the Sage Great Perfection Realm. In fact, he had been pursued for a long time before he had finally been able to escape. Yi Shiwen had returned to the Great Gas City from the Great Gas Collar today. The Great Gas City had become even more crowded during these past several days. He had come to know that there was a Chamber of Commerce in this city. Moreover, it was going to hold an auction very soon, for big forces resided in the Great Gas City. The city government governed the entire city and had been a superforce for a long time. However, the other 3 colossuses, Great Gas Chamber of Commerce, Heaven Dominating Dojo, and the Sky Moon Sword School, operated under the city lord. The Great Gas Chamber of Commerce was the one conducting the auction. They'd conduct such auctions after every monthly vibration of the Great Gas Collar, and they'd gain people's attention every time. Those experts who had harvested big profits from the Great Gas Collar also wanted to sell some magical items. Those magical items were surely exceptional. However, not all of them were suitable for their own use. Therefore, it was better to sell those magical items in the auction and get the equivalent amount of primary spirit dawn instead of having to safeguard them. After all, they could buy the things that they required with the primary spirit dawn. The Great Gas City had become much more crowded than usual at the time of the auction. Many experts had rushed towards the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce. However, nobody dared to cause any disturbance at this time. They were rowdy and arrogant. However, they weren't idiots. They obviously knew that the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce was counted among the 4 big forces of the Great Gas City, and this big force certainly wouldn't sit back and do nothing if someone stirred trouble. A large number of experts who belonged to the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce had been keeping watch outside the Chamber of Commerce. So there was no way to cause a disturbance, even if someone wanted to do so. Yi Shiwen hadn't gotten mixed with the crowd like an average person. Instead, he had gotten hold of a private room. However, he had to make a security deposit of 100 million primary spirit dawn for this room. These primary spirit dawn would be returned to him after the auction. This was the Great Gas Chamber of Commerce's way of checking whether their client had enough financial resources or not. They didn't care about their client's strength. They only cared about their financial resources. Yi Shiwen didn't mind this. After all, he possessed a huge amount of primary spirit dawn if one didn't consider his ceaseless consumption of spirit energy. Moreover, he had obtained tons of primary spirit dawn by killing sage experts here. In fact, he had seized a huge amount of primary spirit dawn, and the total amount in his stock had surpassed 1 billion primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen took Xiao, yet inside the private room, after he had paid 100 million primary spirit dawn. The room wasn't very big. In fact, it was spread across an area of only a dozen or so square meters. However, it looked extremely extravagant since it had been decorated magnificently. Some fruits had been arranged on a table. These were spirit fruits, which contained spirit energy. An average person would feel refreshed after having eaten these fruits, but they were also very beneficial for the experts. The time passed second by second, minute by minute. Soon, all the experts who wished to participate in the auction had arrived. Suddenly, A loud uproar came from the outside as a group of experts walked in. They were headed by a young man whose face looked gentle but slightly gloomy. Gee, what's there in this auction that it has even attracted the attention of young Master Tian Jian of Sky Moon Sword School? Is this the Sky Moon Sword School's young master, Tian Jian? He is outstanding. Look at his exceptionally calm aura. Perhaps he has already entered the sage, great perfection realm. It's no wonder that he is being trained by the Sky Moon Sword School to be their next leader. His strength is simply outstanding. It is said that the Sky Moon Sword School will be represented by him this time around. He will go to the Great Gas Collar to compete for the top 10 positions. To be continued.